Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Standing for Truth Ministries. My name is Donny Matt, and alongside Matt, we are coming to you live for a very special program. Over the last few weeks, our creation research publications, both articles and videos, have stirred up strong reactions. The critics had their say. They raised their objections. And tonight, it's time for us to answer back. From fossils to the flood, plankton to phylogeny, and from the so-called best evidence for evolution to the very heart of the fossil record and dating methods, we'll be showing why evolution's answers crumble under scrutiny and why biblical creation offers the only consistent explanation. This isn't just talk. This is model building in action. Creation confirmed, common descent refuted. So buckle up for a hard-hitting live program where objections collapse, truth stands tall, and biblical creation wins again. You definitely don't want to miss this one. Matt rocking the new Without Lies Evolution Dies shirt. Looking good, brother. How you doing tonight?
Doing good. This is going to be fun. We set a lot of time aside for this one, so you guys are in for a treat today.
Yes, we have a lot of material and content to cover. We've basically been putting together material all day. We wanted to make sure we had everything in order and organized before we go live. And so I do appreciate the patience of those in our live audience. We just want to make sure that we're doing this one right as we are doing it live. And we have a lot to cover and we're excited to get into it. And so Matt, let's start off by breaking the ice a little bit. We have several videos to cover. We have several critics to dismantle, and that includes those in the live chat. If there are questions from non-critics or challenges or follow-up objections from critics themselves, we are doing this live for a reason. As Matt and we did discuss, should we pre-record this? Should we do it live? But we did want to do it live because we want to give you in the audience an opportunity as well to send in your questions and challenges. And I think, Matt, that'll help us to leave no stone unturned. And so, okay, brother, you and we've spent a lot of time discussing the genealogical mutation rate versus the phylogenetic mutation rate. We've demonstrated sufficiently, especially over the summer in our many presentations and our 4.5-hour debate seminar with Culture Cats. We've demonstrated, I believe, sufficiently that diversity in the mitochondrial DNA, diversity in the Y chromosome, it's low. There's really only a few DNA differences separating people between people worldwide in those DNA compartments. The mutation rates are fast. And what we know, and this is where we get into fixation equilibrium, our good friend, desperate Dan Stern-Cardinal, he's attempted to refute fixation equilibrium, but he's failed. And we're going to show many reasons why, but the observed mutation rate, the neutral and nearly neutral mutation rate, does approximate the fixation rate for many reasons that we're going to cover here tonight. I put out several articles laying out fixation equilibrium. And so it's very simple. We have low diversity, few DNA differences in, let's say, the mitochondrial DNA. It's a tiny chromosome that exists outside of the nucleus. It's passed down maternally, and so it's uniparentally inherited DNA. You get it from your mother, and only females pass it on. Again, the mutation rate is fast, and even when we go with a conservative mutation rate, we still get biblical time. But since that observed fast rate approximates the fixation rate, remember, Matt, after the flood, what do we have, brother? We have a time period from the flood to the Tower of Babel dispersal event where we have small populations. The earth restarts with 8 people, Shem, Ham, Japheth, and their 3 wives. Okay. And so we start off with 8 people, 3 reproducing couples. The population grows, but it largely stays isolated, geographically isolated, before they spread out to all parts of the planet. And so rates during that period would have been faster in terms of fixation. Yes, today fixation is basically zero because we have 8 billion people on the planet. If somebody in China gets a random mutation, chances are extremely low, basically zero, that mutation is going to drift to fixation where it's stuck in place. To be fixed basically means to be stuck in place. But during that time period from the flood to Babel, fixation is so fast that there's what's called an equilibrium or a counterbalancing here, where even with selection, even with these mechanisms that critics like Dan Stern-Cardinal put forth to drastically change these rates, it doesn't work. And so the per generation rate still ends up approximating the fixation rate, which means we're looking at biblical time and not evolutionary time. You can't stretch out that diversity back 100 or 200,000 years, but we're going to go through one by one every single one of Dan's papers. And so, Matt, give us a brief summary. What are your thoughts after engaging critics over the years, engaging in several debates, us doing plenty of live shows, publishing quite a bit on this? What are your thoughts on the critics' overall attempts to counter this truly incredible data that confirms biblical origins, brother?
I guess I would be more or less shocked at the distance they'll go to resort to trying to refute it. For example, with mutation rate studies, they'll go to lengths like to look at inbred islands of people, of small groups of people, just to slow it down and ignore the vast body of evidence. They'll look to they'll say, well, you can't trust those carbon dating studies on fossils, those are clearly contaminated, essentially just throwing away everything they've been saying about how accurate radiometric dating is. They'll throw it under the table the first chance they get if it confirms what we've been saying. So as far as I'm concerned, they've already made up their mind. They're not really neutral. They're very biased. And it's funny because everything that they call us is actually what they are.
That's right. Yeah. And we're going to get into that in great detail. So let's start off by having some fun responding to. So we're going to be responding to Simon Dan.
Oh yeah.
We love Simon Dan. If only he would step up to the plate like Conspiracy Cats and engage us in a debate seminar. He can watch the debate with Culture Cats. He'll see that it's fair. We're professional. We're respectful. But we will be doing a debate coming up soon, actually. So, Matt, you and I, we're going to be giving a big presentation, Dismantling Evolution, on Sam Shamoon's channel on October 13th. We have a busy month. We're also going to be doing a 2 versus 2 debate on modern day debate between 2 popular evolutionists. So to those in the audience, stay tuned for that. And so we do have a lot for you guys to look forward to outside of this channel as we expand our arguments and model. And
and early part of December, we're going to be we have presentations that are going to be given for the hydroplate theory conference coming up.
Yeah, you actually already recorded one with Brian Lauer.
I did one yesterday.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So a couple months from now. Yeah. A couple months from now, that'll be live for people to enjoy. And so, okay, so Simon Dan, but let's start with the other Dan, our other favorite Dan. There's a couple from him, but Matt, we have a groundbreaking argument here. Okay. Absolutely earth shattering, creation destroying, groundbreaking, irrefutable argument.
Wow.
From good old Dr. Dan. Okay. Are you ready for this?
This should be good. Yeah.
It's a tough one. It's from what I've seen, because I've thought a lot about what he says here. It's essentially irrefutable. Like, I'm pretty sure Dan has indeed forced us into early retirement. And so we might as well now become evolutionists.
Throw in the towel.
we may as well believe that we're related to banana plants and strawberries, because that's what the science says, because of a very significant point that we are going to hear now. So I'm going to go on mute if there's ever any issues with sound, because I'll be largely. Oh, there we go up there. Creation myths. We're going to be refuting creation myths tonight with creation facts. Okay, here we go. Make sure the sound's on.
This one is fine, right? So right away, we get human engineers design with homologous patterns, right? You reuse things, whatever, right? He goes right to the car analogy, which we've all seen a million times. Now, a couple problems here right away. The car thing is cars don't reproduce, right? So it's not an analogy to biological systems. Explain the patterns of similarity in the context.
He's
of
so
things
serious too. Right?
Yeah, like we didn't know that.
No, I didn't.
Family.
I mean, speak for
Kind of
yourself.
ancestry within.
I thought cars came about
when I say
due to reproduction and the passing on of genes. And so right here,
You learned with cars, actually. Did you ever see cars reproducing?
I never did personally, but I thought that I mean, we have all these cars in these car lots. Like, how did they come about, right?
Yeah.
So Dan's blown my mind. And anyways, you know, a PhD evolutionary biologist, like this is the best they got, right? Not engaging the model, essentially straw manning the model, not understanding what we're saying. And so I wrote an article, several articles that Dan has been incapable of refuting. And so this is the article I wrote, a clarification on 14 evidences. So backstory, I put out a layperson go-to resource article debunking 14 of the best so-called lines of evidence for evolution. Matt, you and I, we've been doing this for 6 years or so. We've also hosted so many debates. I mean, I've hosted over 450, many of those on evolution. I've done 100 of my own formal debates, hundreds informal debates with all the open mics. And as we've seen what the critics say. And so I just put out a nice kind of fact sheet, cheat sheet, go-to resource for people to enjoy and utilize. And then Dan responded to that. And so I responded to his response. And number 3, this is what I said to his groundbreaking creation dismantling point. Cars don't reproduce. Apparently it takes, 10 years of school and a PhD to figure that out. But here's what I say, and then Matt, we'll get your thoughts. This is my favorite part of his video. This showcases just how weak the evolutionary position really is. At 7:40 and again at 11:18. Yeah, it's such a profound argument. He does use it again, understandably so. I mean, it's that good, so I might as well repeat it a couple times. Dr. Dan scoffs at my use of the car analogy. He goes right to the car analogy. This is what Dan said, which we've seen a million times. Cars don't reproduce. It's not an analogy for biological systems. There's something I could say there, but I'll refrain. We've joked behind the scenes, Matt. This demonstrates rhetoric, not argument. Analogies are meant to illustrate reasoning patterns, not be literal equivalents. The car example shows that shared design features don't require common ancestry. Engineers across continents independently produce vehicles with headlights, wheels, and windshields because those features are optimal design solutions. Similarly, homologous structures in biology can reflect common design. And ironically, if cars did reproduce, manufacturers would rejoice. Here's something I want to expand on. Because self-replication is a design feature vastly superior to human engineering. Far from weakening the analogy. This is why I say responses from people like Dan and the more informed critics, they're actually gifts, early Christmas presents to us biblical creationists, because it shows how weak the overall position is. Because if the apostles of fish to fisherman evolution like Dan, okay, the go-to guys on this topic, if this is the best they have to offer, then all of your other guardians of common descent, all of your other apologists of evolution, it's only going to get worse from there, right? Because they largely just kind of repeat the arguments that they're hearing from some of the more informed evolutionists. But it also gives us the opportunity to showcase even further how overwhelming the evidence is for biblical creation. And so far from weakening the analogy, the reproductive capacity of life strengthens the case for design. The creator built systems beyond anything humans can achieve. In a nutshell, what does our model suggest? The Bible says God creates man in his image. Therefore, there must be something about us that reflects the divine. And so perhaps we can get an idea, not a perfect understanding, because we're dealing with God who's infinite. If I could fit the infinite God in my 3-pound brain, he wouldn't be a God worth worshiping, as Kent has said before brilliantly. And so we can get an idea for how God may have designed and ordered things based on the way we design and order things. It just turns out we design in homologous patterns, we design in nested hierarchical patterns, but we're limited. God actually went above and beyond what we could do, and he designed the biological order to reproduce and pass on their genes and adapt. Could you imagine if car manufacturers were able to design a vehicle, Matt, that could self-replicate? They design one, a foundational model, an archetype, click a button, and then that just self-replicates. They're going to save a ton of money for not having to have all these workers working on the line. Okay. They're going to make billions of dollars. This is going to be revolutionary, but we're limited. We're catching up to God, but God's still so far above and beyond. Okay. But it's not a coincidence that we as human engineers are designing things that are reflective, that are analogous to what we find in the biological world. And these are the points that Dan simply does not engage. These are the deeper points that a critic like Dan is so unwilling to interact with. Anyways, Matt, what are your thoughts, brother? Creation's false. You can't use analogies. You can't compare the biological world to modes of transportation because cars don't reproduce. What are your thoughts, brother?
Oh man, well, you know, the analogies are made for the general public, so because they need analogy sometimes. Dan, having a PhD, might not need an analogy because he's studied it. He's paid thousands of dollars and he's got years under his belt to understand and break it down. So somebody like him might not like it. But guess what? These analogies have existed for a very long time. And look at this. This is from 1990. It's an evolutionist who used the car analogy. And this is 35 years ago. And look, he said, this evidence is so solid and comprehensive that it cannot be denied by any reasonable person. What's he talking about? He's talking about the homology, about how these structures show a pattern. Now, the question would be, when you look at that, do you see a pattern? Somebody else did as well. And this is very early on because the original pattern for homology was created by a creationist, by Sir Patrick Owen. That's right. So homology is actually evidence for creation. It was Darwin who later came along and said similarity due to common design, and he changed it to similarity due to common ancestry. He was very good at plagiarizing people. But what happened is Owen had this concept of an archetype, and from that flowed all of the other organisms. And he also used analogies. The archetype was an analogy. How ironic is that? That the very person that invented homology used an analogy to help a layman understand what he's talking about. Analogies are great. We know that cars don't reproduce. If we thought that they did, maybe we would add a new gender to the ever-growing list. But I don't think they do reproduce. I've never seen it, but I do sleep at night. So perhaps they're nocturnal breeders. I don't know. I'll have to set my camera up later. And so what Owen did is he said sea creatures and birds were created first. So therefore, we should find a homology pattern going through and then find it in land animals later, culminating in the epitome, the pinnacle of creation, which would be humans. And this would be the most optimal design that there is, which is ironic because now look at the world. Humans live in every niche that there is. We've dominated every other life form on Earth. Clearly, we're the most powerful system that there is. So the best design I'm saying that there is. So I think that this is not using an analogy is a disservice to people that are new and getting into this and maybe not even like science too much. Analogies are very important, and that's why we will continue to use them. And if we can improve on them, we will. I've heard Kent say, have you ever taken a CD and you make a copy of that CD? And then you take that new CD and you make a copy of that. And then you keep doing that. You ever notice that each copy gets a little bit worse and worse? And then, 100 copies later, it doesn't sound even remotely as good as the original did. That's a very good analogy for showing the breakdown of the human genome over time. We accumulate mutations just like that CD would accumulate damage over time and never be as clear as the original. So those analogies are designed to help us understand things. And I think they work good. We might not use cars later. Why? Because there's plenty of other analogies like you're working on right now with Pokemon. So
great points. Yeah, those are points that we're going to expand on, actually. For example, the Pokemon analogy, the regional hypothesis that Dan has instantly fallen in love with. I've put out a response to his response this morning. And so we'll cover a little bit of that as well. I'm catching up on audience questions, objections, challenges. Send those in because we do, again, want to leave no stone unturned. Scriptures and Stones. Good to have you, brother. This is not really a critique, just more of a question related to the problem of evil. Do you think God designed mutations from the beginning, or was it a contingency post-fall? Quick couple thoughts. Matt, we can get your thoughts. I don't believe God created Adam and Eve and the original created kinds with mutations, with deleterious mutations. I think the majority of what we see in terms of DNA differences in autosomal nuclear DNA, biparentally inherited DNA, evolutionists interpret those as being the result of mutations over time. The origin of genetic diversity to the evolutionist is mutations. Mutations accumulate, natural selection acts upon that diversity that builds up over time. You have gene flow, you have genetic drift, recombination, gene conversion, epigenetics. They have all these mechanisms that they look to drive evolutionary change or adaptive evolution. But what the creation model would suggest and what the data supports is that God would have created Adam and Eve, and then this expands. This applies to the created order as a whole. God would have front-loaded pre-existing DNA differences that are beneficial, that are functional, that are healthy, that can be utilized. And that's why it doesn't take a long time to generate variety or novel species, because those genetic variants are built in from the start. Now, let's see here. I should clarify, I mean the natural processes that form mutations. Yeah, because God withdrew a lot of his sustaining powers that were present in the created world, in the garden as well, then mutations could be introduced, because mutations are basically just typographical errors, spelling mistakes in a text. We have these incredibly designed DNA repair enzymes that go in and fix a lot of these DNA breaks, but they don't work perfectly. And that's just the nature of the fall. And because they don't work perfectly, mutations are introduced to the next generation. And that could take me down a rabbit trail of mutually interdependent systems like DNA and DNA repair enzymes that the evolutionist has never had a good argument for. But there could be, so for example, we do have what could be non-random mutations where certain areas in the genome, due to God's foreknowledge, him thinking ahead, right, Matt? Certain areas of the genome could be designed to mutate non-randomly that would lead to some form of adaptation or multiple alleles. Rather than just, two, you could have areas in the genome like the immune system. Having more variety in the immune system, having more variation in the immune system could actually be beneficial in light of life existing in a fallen world. And so, yes, I do believe, due to God's foreknowledge, that some areas in the genome are designed to mutate. Sydney Raptor, where are the genetic sequences that are consistent with all this front loading? Well, we've written extensively on this and done many videos. How can we tell the difference between a created allele, and so a designed allele, and one due to mutations? Well, we would look to common versus rare as a good start. We'd look to disease causing. We would look to function. You and I, Matt, we have 3 million spots in our DNA where we have differences. And then worldwide common differences, if I remember correctly, we've got roughly 10 million And so you could take all those common alleles, put them into Noah and his family. And then since it was a bottleneck, you can double that in Adam. Adam could have had about 20 million. But a huge test of this model is DNA function. And we've got evidence for over 80% of the genome having biochemical activity and therefore evidence for function. So not 10% of the genome being functional, but over 80%. And of course, they say that that's spurious and that's noise. And I put out an entire article on that any critic, I'll quickly put that up on screen. Any critic like Sydney Raptor, appreciate having you here, is welcome to attempt to refute it. And so unmasking the genome, the end of junk DNA. And so this is a comprehensive article, and I've left no stone unturned. I've addressed the argument that this is all just noise or spurious. I've addressed the challenge put forth by people like Dr. Dan Stern-Cardinal that what about transcriptionally silent DNA units like pseudogenes and endogenous retroviruses? What about conserved versus non-conserved regions of the genome? And so feel free. I've done a lot of work on the topic of junk DNA and function. And right here, anticipating criticisms. Biochemical activity does not equal function. Response activity is costly. Widespread activity without function would be wasteful and harmful. Independent studies confirm functional outcomes. Lack of conservation means lack of function. Some functions are species specific, example, ERVs and placental development. Non-conservation does not mean non-function, so on and so forth. So we've addressed all the objections to that. So yes, a major prediction of design diversity would be what? DNA function. And that's exactly what we're finding, function after function after function. Anyways, Matt, I said a lot there. It's a good question. I appreciate Scriptures and Stones elaborating a bit on it. What are your thoughts, brother?
This is a subject that I really like. And so I guess if we go back to the beginning, there could be two different views from a creationist. One would be at the fall, mankind immediately started gathering mutations from a perfect genetic sequence. Another would be that mankind was removed from the tree of life, and somehow the fruit that grew on that tree was somehow removing a lot of the mutations and keeping them at bay, since man had immortality as long as he had access to that tree. So therefore, there's two types of mutations that you can think of. One would be germline that Donny was referring to, and another one would be somatic mutations. Think about when you drink alcohol and you smoke, you're going to build up more somatic mutations. These are mutations that build up in your skin cells and in your body that don't get inherited, but they age you rapidly. They're what can cause cancer and things like that. They're based on our habits and our lifestyle choices. And so something like the tree of life might have kept those at bay. And then when we were removed, it doesn't matter, the fall was still the cause, but regardless, if it was access to the tree of life that we were now denied, or if whether or not they immediately started kicking in, it doesn't matter, because that shows us that we go from a consensus sequence that was fully functional to now accumulating mutations and not being able to get rid of them from our model. And so they would build up over time, and then telomeres at the end of each chromosome that worked as padding that are protecting us from disease now shorten each cellular replication. And when those wear out, now we don't have a buffer for diseases and cancers and things like that. So now we can die from these diseases, where we know telomere sequences have function, just like every other sequence in the genome has function. That's why genetic similarity was actually predicted by creationists first, based on functional design. And then we find out that these functions aren't just one, like one sequence doesn't just do one function. These sequences can do multiple functions, right? That's what Nathaniel Jensen predicted. He said, I bet you there's layers of function that we're going to find that these sequences do. He made that prediction in 2015. So that's why there's some things that have more genetic similarity that you wouldn't expect us to have so much similarity with, like a pig. Why would a pig have so much similarity with us? Like 98%, something extremely high. It's because a lot of think about their skin. They have a subcutaneous layer of fat that runs underneath the epidermis, just like humans do. We have different eye colors like they do. Their kidneys are very similar to us, and ours isn't very similar to the chimpanzee. So we have so many similarities because those sequences that helped us form are also shared with other organisms. And that was our prediction. So I hope that answered it. And
that's a good response. Some good thoughts, Matt. And so to reiterate some of the points that I was making based on the question. Great question, because a lot of critics will say, well, there's just too many instances of variation, too many alleles, more than 2 at some spots. I did a whole video on this. Most of the variation in the world is 2 alleles, A or a T, G or a C. An allele is a genetic variant, as we know. So there's been many family trees since Adam, right? You have Adam and Eve, and then they have kids, their kids have kids. And so there's a lot of branches on that family tree, a lot of mutations being introduced. And so I also do believe that some genes are designed to change for adaptation. The human immune system is a good example. And so essentially, in a nutshell, explaining diversity is quite easy. It'd be a mix of what? Created heterozygosity, that organisms were created in a state of DNA diversity, and mutations, most of those being deleterious and disease causing and damaging, but some of them being non-random, because many genes are basically designed to be hit with mutations in light of certain stressors and stimuli, allowing for adaptation. And
Right,
that
like
could explain a
hotspots.
lot of, right, yeah, hotspots. And that's what we see in a lot of the cases of like private alleles. If I remember correctly, Dr. Chris Thompson likes to look to that. Okay, so we're caught up on questions, on topic questions, Matt. And so let's move into our next segment here, unless there's something you wanted to add before we do, brother.
No, I just was making sure we caught up on questions. I thought we had a bunch. I'm glad we can go on, because it would be a long episode on one topic.
One topic, exactly. Once
we'll
we get
never stop.
going,
We'll just keep going, yeah.
man. So I'll do a real quick commercial break. Endogenous Retrovirus Handbook, dismantling the best evidence for common descent. Groundbreaking new research here. I've had an active research project over the years in a similar way. Matt has had an active research project on dating methods and also answering the heat problem. And so I have compiled a lot of my research and conclusions into an expanded edition of my ERV handbook. The appendices, they're a must read. I go over my novel hypothesis, the segregated design model, and I'm very happy with it. I'm confident that we are model building. We're moving forward in a positive manner. The so-called best evidence revolution has been dismantled at the first publication of this book, but now we're model building. We're offering a superior explanation, and we're addressing in detail questions dealing with fixed and unfixed ERVs, solo LTRs, fixed and unfixed LTRs, and also the origin of retroviruses in general. So some really fascinating material. I do recommend people check that out. And truth and research. So obviously, as Matt knows, as we've been discussing, Matt, feel free to elaborate on this. I'll screen share, go into the article section. So if you go to articles, Matt and I, we've been writing somewhere between 8 and 12 hours a day for the last month. And we've published a lot of what we've been writing recently over the last week or two. We've done a lot of research. This is our truth and research division, and we have them all compiled in the article section. And so you can scroll through here, have a look at what we've published, a little bit of everything as well. I just published something I've been working on for a while, the case for premillennialism. Comprehensive. I leave no stone unturned. I do it with grace and respect towards our fellow brothers and sisters that may agree with the pre-mill position, but you can check that out. And so anyways, our goal is to expand truth and research to not just this section on the website, but have a I say secondary, but we do have our Creatious Clothing website. So in a way, a third website, truthandresearch.com, that's strictly meant for research publications, research articles, lectures. We're going to add in lectures. And so I would copy all of these over nicely and neatly into another website, Truth and Research. And I have a lot more ideas to make that website look really cool and visually appealing and very informative in terms of the content that people will find there, dismantling evolution, confirming creation. Now, we need your support, your funding for that, as we put a lot of our own money, time, work, and effort, of course, into this main website and the channel. And so I put out a call to action just about a week ago. And praise the Lord for all the support that has already come in funding the truthandresearch.com website. We're now about halfway there to what we need to get that going, but also to keep it going into the future. And so for those, please, who, if it's on your heart and you want to support what we're doing here and you want to see that truthandresearch.com website become manifested where we can all benefit from it, then feel free to support our efforts. You can do it through the website, over PayPal. You can become a patron. But I am happy to say that after a week, we're already halfway there. And so God bless those that have chosen to support this project that we know will be greatly beneficial to the cause of creation. Matt, speak a little bit about what we've been doing here in terms of these articles, what we've been focusing on, who we've been debunking, and perhaps get a little bit into the model building that we find to be so important. Feel free to go over some slides and visuals, brother. And then once we're done with that, we'll jump into our next video. Go ahead.
All right. Yeah. When we decided to kind of make a U-turn and deal with writing some articles, we noticed that there's a lot of things missing when you type in young Earth creation and a specific topic. You won't find answers to everything, and whether or not it's because there's not enough people writing articles, or just in general, there's not a lot of young Earth creationists, right? So when a particular topic comes up, let's say that you type in the oldest tree on Earth, and you come up with a tree system called Pando. And you type in young Earth creation, nothing comes up for that. So we thought to ourselves, let's do articles on subjects that are hard to find, that you just don't get answers to. Why not? Because everybody has questions. And I really like making videos. That's my thing, because they seem to reach more people. But if people have something they can go to and get a resource, I'm all for that. So that's why we've now deviated and kind of shifted into these articles. And it's pretty cool. For example, that one that I just mentioned, Pando, that's a good one. And I will show you real quick what we've been doing. 1 second. I don't know why it's not sharing. Oh, I need to remove the other one. My bad. It's basics. All right. This is the study that is now up on there. It's one of the ones that you can find. And I noticed that there is nothing online about this. So this was one of the first ones that I started working on. And when I went online to research, I found that there is a specific study that decided to test the age of this. Like, how did they get this old age for the tree? Because it dated around 16,000 to 80,000 years old. That was really old. Well, guess what? They used a phylogenetic approach to infer the age of the Pando system. So again, using evolution to prove evolution. And what I did is I said, oh, look at this. They used 3 estimates to determine the age of it, all based on phylogeny, which is evolution theory. So you scroll down in the study and you'll notice that here's what they did. And they found a mutation rate, and they pulled it from another study. And this was the leaf somatic mutation rate right here. And it's quite slow. So I go to the study, and lo and behold, there's a different answer in the very study itself, that you found another mutation rate that didn't take any assumptions into it and was a complete somatic mutation rate. So it was high frequency. It gathered up all the information. It didn't leave out anything, and it was much more accurate. And lo and behold, the mutation rate was very fast. And so I took that and I said, let's run the mutation rate based on, a coalescence, and determine how old the tree system actually is. And you get a date of around 5,210 years old. And that falls in line perfectly with the biblical young Earth creation timeline. And here's something else very interesting. I decided, let's run a simulation, because what they've done is they've assumed that this tree system, by the way, it grows under the ground and it spreads through roots That's how the entire tree system that you're looking at, when you see all the different trees, they're all one tree. It's all one organism living underneath the ground. So they assumed that one tree arose right here, and then it grew underground, and then it grew into this tree, and then it grew underground into this tree, and then to this tree. Obviously, from one area, one location, it's spread to all of the other trees. But is that how clones work? Not always. Sometimes you get wind that'll blow branches and twigs, or a bird will pick one up and fly it and make a nest somewhere. Or it'll rain and water will wash it down, and they'll independently start to grow root systems, and then they'll grow towards one another. And it can grow a massive tree system in rapid amounts of time. So I'm obviously going to go with the mutation rate. I think that's more empirical than an assumption that this could have happened. But there's multiple scenarios that can answer this in a biblical timeline. And that's why I did this study. It's just one great example of how the data is just always trying to push evolution, right? Well, then again, of course, they need the grant money. They need to push things older. And it's just much easier for them to actually do that and get more grant money, because that's where it's at right now. And plus, you can say, I discovered the oldest tree system. So there's rewards that come from this as well. Another good one that we just finished and put up, called Flood, Fire, and Ice. It's how a global flood started volcanism, which sparked an ice age that shaped human diversity. So what that's like is, we say that what happened is, after the flood, a small group of people migrated into the north. This area was at the start of the ice age, starting to get cold and inhospitable, very harsh conditions, as where most of the population, they migrated into the south. And by doing that, you get smaller populations that went north, now known as Neanderthal, Denisovan, Homo erectus. It's the phenotypes that we see. They're just an early group of people that went north. So lots of gene flow, lots of gene conversion is going on. And what can happen is, if those things are going on in these small scattered tribes, you get lots of substitutions that are happening and fixating rapidly because of their population size and gene flow. So this study specifically focuses on what's that going to look like. And we show that the mutation rate that we see and that we observe matches perfectly. And here's another one that we added to that very study: caves. Something that Donny has made predictions that if people lived in these caves and they were around these types of rocks and they drank water from wells or water that ran over these rocks, they would have radiation. They would come into contact with things that would cause more mutations to occur in them. And so what I did is I said, look, we're going to go online, and we're going to find the locations where these skulls were located and found and discovered and dated. And we're going to say, okay, this is the map that we know where these were found. Now, let's take this. This is an area of Precambrian rocks that are exposed on the surface. So this is where they would have lived in caves and drank the water from and been around these dangerous rocks. So let's see if that's true. Well, guess what? Donnie's prediction actually lands up absolutely perfect with where those rocks are located and where humans actually lived. Here's a zoomed in area of what exactly that looks like in the dark spots. And look at where they were found. Exactly where those locations are. Now, here's another thing. How about in the north? Because when we go into the north, we also find that's where Neanderthal lived and went extinct and where they died. Well, guess what? Those red dots that you see right here in the study show exactly where Neanderthal camps were. Those triangles are where they found lots of ash content. Ash comes from volcanoes. A massive row of volcanoes exist right here, and another very large volcano went off here in this vicinity, and the wind blew the ash this direction. So Neanderthal literally lived around areas where there's, we know, volcanism living around such a thing. The gases that off gas would also cause lots of mutations. So the model that we're building shows that these groups of people would literally have been around things that were causing harm, where opposed to other locations, they would not have, aka around the Tower of Babel. Now, here's another thing. Volcanoes pump out iridium. If you look at the iridium anomalies, look at where they're found. Exactly where Neanderthal and Denisovan lived, and nowhere around the Middle East by the Tower of Babel. So another thing that could have rapidly aged them. So if early man migrated into the north, after the flood, they would have eventually returned. where would we have expected them to mate with, aka Homo sapiens, if they weren't actually, if they were a different species? That's irrelevant because they can't be, based on the definition of the term species. They would have been the same because they were able to mate with us. So where would that event have actually taken place? We would say that they would have migrated back down to where the population was living by the Tower of Babel in the Middle East. And guess what? When you look up where inbreeding between archaic and modern humans happened, they placed the event right in that location. So then I started to search. I'm like, where exactly does it place this event? Lo and behold, you can't make this up. It's so perfect. It's literally where we would say that the Tower of Babel existed. Check this out. And you look up just randomly, type in, where was the Tower of Babel? Look at where it puts it. Tower of Babel right here. Where's the Tower of Babel? Right here. And where do the humans and Neanderthal meet up and have reproduce? Exactly where the population was living at the time. Neanderthal, one small group migrated back down, came up against the massive population that they had left from 1,000 years earlier. They had a hybrid. And now all of us share their DNA, because back then the population was so small, it allowed Neanderthal DNA to spread through the entire population. And now everyone has it. Remember, they predicted Africans would have 0 Neanderthal DNA in them. And guess what? They found the exact opposite. So that's just one of many studies that we've done, that we finished, that we've hyper focused on the details. And we have others, post-flood populations, from the beginning, a table of creation for speech-related design. This is the human study of language origins. I mean, we've already pumped out a lot of information. So I'm loving it. It's great. It just takes a lot of time.
Yeah. And that's why we're excited and thrilled. Shepherd, appreciate that, brother. Good to have you. That's why we're excited and thrilled to expand what we're doing here on Truth and Research. I find it hilarious, Matt, that so far all of the attempts that critics have done to try and refute the research that we've put out has been an epic fail. It's been more rhetoric than substance. Dan, for a time, was the spell check sheriff, complaining about the tools that we choose to use to proofread, to edit.
Oh, and emojis. He's very mad you use emojis. Yeah,
emoji sheriff as well. And so none of the material has been debunked or interacted with in any sophisticated manner. But remember, cars don't reproduce, and we'll definitely be making a clip of that section at the beginning of this. And so, Matt, excellent points. Here's my original research article where I made the prediction about radiation rocks and the effects those would have on Neanderthal genomes. Neanderthals and separate ancestry, a comprehensive creationist response. I've debated this many times over the years. I actually did a formal debate going back like 5 or 6 years ago now. It feels, at least, with Dr. Dan Stern-Cardinal on Neanderthals, done many informal exchanges on it. I've written on it. Anyways, we've answered the genetic challenge of Neanderthals. We've addressed it sufficiently. And I did a follow-up as well. I believe it was Stefan Frello, our good friend, Dr. Stefan Frello, and I debunked his talking points. This is a follow-up. The genetics of Neanderthals fit the Bible, not deep time. These articles on Patreon are, for the most part, all publicly available. And so if you go to the article sections, the ones that are publicly available, I've got them here. You can click it. It'll take you right to it. The out of Africa claim exposed, what the data really show. And so we've been thorough, Matt. We get into mutation rate variation, epicenter bias, diversity always clusters near the starting hub of dispersal. Africa's hotspot fits with Babel as the true epicenter of deep time. And so do check out these responses, specifically this one, debunking critics on Neanderthals, that yes, radiation rocks, drinking from water, chemically infused, as you said, Matt, the harsh environmental factors associated with where and how how Neanderthals living in small isolated population, having faster rates of fixation, accelerated mutation accumulation, at the beginning of their history, and then as their history goes on, they become more inbred, isolated in different tribes, and you have a lot of mutations coming forth and becoming rapidly fixed, which is shifting them in terms of genetics, especially from us modern or extant humans. Environmental stressors as accelerants. And so we document all of this. We support it all with the conventional literature, showing that exactly what we're saying is supported by the conventional literature. So for the critics, very difficult for them to debunk. But I do want to get into these pedigrees, pedigree versus phylogeny. And so we could do an entire 5-hour program on Neanderthals. But let's get into Dan's video here, because I know people want to see us. I've had comments come in that have read, people have really appreciated the articles we put out, but they want to see a video of us basically responding to Dan's argument on pedigrees versus phylogeny, these island populations. And so that's what we'll do here. Doki doki. Appreciate that, brother. And let's just catch up on questions real quick. Tanya Brown, what kind of constraints do you place on the directed mutations? Well, what we see is a lot of morphological variation. So real quick response is the constraints that I would put is we wouldn't be seeing any novel phenotypes come about that were not already built in. So we're going to see a lot of morphological adaptation and variation that's built into the created kinds, the created order, but we're not going to see any real true anatomical novelty. That's where the evolutionists struggle. Yeah, we see a lot of morphological variation and adaptability in the biological world, but where's the true anatomical novelty? So that would be a quick answer that I would offer. But the data would still overwhelmingly suggest that mutations are deleterious. They build up, selection can't see them, they're invisible, they're subject to genetic drift, and so species descend more and more into genetic sickness. That's a good question.
And there
Lorraine,
descend.
Matt.
There you have it. You said descend. It's descent with modification. We don't see ascent anywhere. There are no novel anatomical features being added to anything. So they might claim that there is, but the whole textbook of like a sponge, show us one organism adding a new anatomical feature in any experiment where evolution is trying to add something novel arising. They can't even do the basics. So if they can't perform the basics with irradiating creatures, putting them in whatever environment they want, changing their diet, they do everything they possibly can and can't get any example. And the examples that they have are just so bad they're easily refuted, like the Italian wall lizard. That it's just that's it. That's all you've got. A whole world full of organisms speciating every day, and you got nothing. So.
That's enough for them to believe that they're related to those lizards, Matt, related to strawberries, banana plants, related to monkeys, fish. And so, yeah, I mean, a lot of what we see, even in terms of their best so-called examples of beneficial mutations, is general adaptation based on the pre-existing ability to adapt in the first place. And we just recently had a speaker, Brian Young, give some really interesting examples of rapid adaptation, Matt, in real time, observed in real time. And so, okay, let's move to the next video here. Keep those questions coming in, guys, and we will be happy to engage them. So we addressed Dan's groundbreaking, earth-shattering, creation dismantling argument, cars don't reproduce. So we're done with that one. We've decided to come out of retirement, eh, Matt? So here we go.
Yeah, exactly. You're going to get the old us.
So what Dan has done, for those interested in comprehensive rebuttals to everything Dan says, go to the article section. Dan first responded to my 14 evidences against evolution debunked. Then I responded to his video in detail, left no stone unturned. I even demonstrated right from the literature that Dan is invested in, historical revisionism about junk DNA. And so you can check that out. Then Dan, rather than responding to my response, he ended up attempting to respond to my fixation equilibrium article. I went in, dismantled all those points. Then he attempted to refute my pre-flood regional hypothesis in explaining the so-called ordering of the fossil record with the Pokemon analogy. We're going to get into that, but we're going to get into that after this. And then this morning, because his arguments were so bad, almost no thought put into them, mostly straw man arguments, misunderstandings, he got debunked in both Pokemon and science. 0 for 2. And so that only took a few hours for me to refute because it was just so easy. So that's published. That's up on Patreon currently, but to the public. And so that's kind of the story so far with Dan. And then Dan, he ends up putting out a community post where he says, oh, why is Donny so obsessed? Why is Stand for Truth Ministries so obsessed? Because we were responding to him.
All we do is answer questions. What do you want to just make a video and then get no answer and say, see, they can't answer anything. So we're damned if we do and damned if we can't. You know, it makes no sense.
Well, in his case, and I put out an article titled Why Dr. Dan Tapped Out. He's the one that he responded to my 14 evidences. And so, Matt, you and I, we like to leave no stone unturned. We're not a ministry that just allows the critics to get away with bad argumentation and rescue devices. Maybe there's a lot of evolutionists that want to attack certain creationists and then not expect a response. Not with us. We come in fighting spiritually and with information. And so we are invested in countering objections. And so I just find that funny when, he was the first one to put out a response. But we love Dan. We as we've said many times, he gives us many gifts to creation science. Matt, when I play this video, just let me know if I clicked share audio. So Here we go. Let me know if the audio is coming through.
No, it is not.
Okay. I thought
Reset
so.
It.
Let me do this again to the audience. Keep sending in those questions, challenges. We did this live for several reasons, but one big reason is we want to interact with your comments. So here we go.
Yeah, we saved a bunch so far. So
yes. So here we go. Why creationists are wrong. Matt, you're going to love this one. Yeah, this is a good one. Here we go.
Are wrong. Aside from all those other reasons that we're not going to talk about, not the topic of this video. The first thing we're going to point out for why creationists are wrong when they use pedigree mutation rates to justify a young Earth is that they're cherry picking. It's not more complicated than that. They like some studies, they dislike other studies. And I know this is shocking, right? Like, stop the presses. Creationists are cherry picking. But it's really important and really interesting to see exactly what they're doing here. In this context, creationists like to use single generation pedigree studies that basically show parent, offspring, how many differences, generation rate. These two papers that are on screen right now are the main papers that creationists are going to use to do this for mitochondrial DNA, right? It's this Parsons paper from the late 90s and Ding 2015. That's the one that Jeanson leans on.
Matt, can you give us a breakdown before we continue of the Parsons paper and why it still stands strong, even in light of what the critics continue to repeat?
Well, Parsons had access to a blood bank at the time, and this is because he worked for the FBI. And so what he did is he said, let's run a pedigree rate, because the only ones that we have prior to this, like Howell and other people, they had a pedigree rate as well, but they had it from diseased people, something that had Leberner syndrome with eyes and things. So they said, let's do a real one. Let's do it with just a whole world population. We'll mix all the different ethnic diversities and we'll gather it from the FBI database, and we'll compare them all and get a substitution rate and a mutation rate. And they did. So he gathered 10 of the best geneticists at the time. And some of them are still working today. And they amassed together and they said, okay, let's do make sure we have an ethnical mixed diversity. Hold on. Sorry, I'm going to remove that one real quick just so I can screen share. We got to make sure that we have a good amount of diversity of ethnicities in this, because if we're going to get a substitution rate. So they had 90 African Americans, 115 Afro-Caribbeans, 114 people from Sierra Leone, Africa, 90 Hispanics, 100 British Caucasians, 233 European. The database was huge. So nobody could say like, this is just a weak sampling, very, very small, and it doesn't go back very far in generational time. It actually did. And so he got massive amounts of different rates. The AFDIL family was the most, actually. Check this rate out. This runs really fast. 73 lineages, more than any other thing. And they had a substitution rate of 1 out of every 17. Super rapid. Extremely fast. We don't even use that one, and it's that fast. Imagine if we use that one. Anyway, the Amish, that's when he discovered Amish families actually mutate slower. They get only 1 out of every 80. So it's he noticed, wow, different populations in different people groups mutate at different speeds. So he just used 1 out of 32. He just averaged it out and said, that's the average substitution rate. So then what he did is said, let's look at the mutation rate. And he said, okay, what is the coalescence calculations give us? He said, well, if the average person is or the maximum diversity in the human population is 120, then how many generations ago did the most recent common ancestor for all living people exist? He got 6,500 years. What in the evolutionary timeline could have bottlenecked humanity 6,500 years ago to have all women on Earth, even in isolated populations, be the most recent common ancestor? Nothing. So this was a groundbreaking study without any bias, just looking at the data purely. And Dan says, it's not good enough. It didn't look deep enough into, well, you don't need deep enough pedigrees when you have that many going on, because you're looking at multiple different families. You're going back 2 to 3 generations, and you're getting a great amount of mutations in the database. And all of the geneticists agreed, like, this is great. This is amazing. So they published it. And then they came around a year later just to make sure that everything was correct. And they got a little bit faster. They got 1 substitution every 30 generations for the substitution rate on average. So it's still published. It's still being used by the FBI. When we reached out to him to see if he wanted to talk about this, he got defensive. He was like, no, you can publish your study and try to refute me. I've done all of that in the 90s. I'm not interested in debating this anymore. It's a fact. So, years later, they came back, they found, look at this, yielding an overall divergence mutation rate of every 25 to 40 generations. Both of our studies came to the remarkably similar conclusion, says Howell, that these studies were published in the late 1996. Look at that. Same results years later. And it doesn't end there. I mean, we can go all the way to 2025. And we have a recent pedigree, the largest that's ever been in. He puts Parsians to shame. It's the exact same rate. So, well, what's his complaint on that one? It's a deep-rooted pedigree as well.
Right. Well, it's an amazing time to be a biblical creationist. And it's funny because years ago, when we were responding to these critics, we showed Parsons' response to us. And yeah, I mean, he's basically putting it out there to the critics, challenging them. Okay, let's see you do a better job. And so, Matt, I appreciate that. I have a few points I want to add, but I'm going to wait until it's relevant to what Dan is going to say. So I'm going to put this back up on screen. Oh, I got to remove yours.
Yeah, it's tricky. They changed it, huh? They've never had to do that before. Yeah.
No, a little extra work for us. Okay, here we go. Matt, I think when you play around with the mic, it like kind of gives like a blowing noise.
Oh, sorry.
No worries. Just want to let you know. Okay. Yeah, that was great. That was a great overview. And so I do have a few contributing points, but let's allow Dan to make his case a little bit longer.
In his Answers Research Journal publication, these 2 studies show approximately the same thing, of about 1 mutation every 6 generations, give or take, but they're in the same kind of.
Oh, by the way, in my fixation equilibrium article, which I'm working on a paper for, I use a conservative estimate, 0.1 per generation, and it still lines up beautifully with average differences between 20 and 30. And then when we expand to explain African diversity, the entire model is very consistent with the data, and that's with a conservative number. So you can actually see the math and the numbers. But of course, taking that conservative number and applying it to fixation equilibrium, a good way to explain fixation equilibrium using an analogy because Dan loves analogies so much, but for the audience. And I wrote about this I came up with a couple simple ways to kind of convey this more technical reality or topic in an article, so I can direct people to there. But let's say you have a road and you have a bunch of cars entering that road, right? Well, a lot of the cars are never going to make it to the end of the road. Cars are going to break down, maybe they'll run out of gas. But let's say you do have one car that makes it to the end of the road, okay, every so often. Well, because you have so many cars on that road, then there's going to be an equilibrium where you've always consistently got that one car, even though most cars are not making it to the end of the road. You've always got one car making it to the end of the road. And with fixation equilibrium, what we know is we have a lot of people on the planet. And let's go back to the time of the flood. You have a growing population, an expanding population. People are having kids, they're having offspring. Those kids are growing up and having kids. And so you have healthy gene flow, mutations are accumulating, mutations are being passed on. And so even though a lot of mutations are lost, you've always got, let's say in the mitochondrial DNA, 0.1 reaching fixation. So that's the equilibrium point. So when a critic says, oh, well, you're looking at the observed rate, you're looking at neutral or nearly neutral mutations. Nearly neutral mutations are also acting in the same way that neutral mutations would act. As a matter of fact, the majority are nearly neutral anyways, in light of what we know about the function of the genome. And so the observed rate is fast. It approximates the fixation rate. And so I think people can see the issue when evolutionists want to say, well, you got to look to the fixation or long-term substitution rate or accumulation rate. They're both fast because it approximates. And even in the evolutionary model, they don't even know their own model, Matt, because they believe that today's history, where people are spread out across the planet, there's 8 billion people, that only happened recently in evolutionary history. So if you have a long pen, the tip of that pen, that's basically human history as we know it, last 5,000 years for the evolutionary model. For most of their history, they have human beings existing in Africa in smaller, isolated populations. People did not spread out to all parts of the globe. Okay, population's small overall within tribes, and then take all those tribes combined and just a general population size. And so you have faster rates of fixation for most of evolutionary history. That's why there's fixation equilibrium, where there's not a huge alteration in the observed rate and then also the fixation rate. And that includes selection and all these factors that Dan says that we ignore. And so hopefully that just makes it a little more understandable, but that's why you have a lot of cars on that road that are crashing and burning, running out of gas, not making it, but you've got that one car that does make it, because you got a lot of cars that are on the road, a lot of cars entering the road. There's always going to be that one car making it to the end of the road, just like you've always got that 0.1 mutation reaching fixation in the mitochondrial genome. Before we move on, does that make sense, Matt, what I'm saying?
Well, unfortunately, it was a car analogy, so you know what's going to happen.
Cars don't reproduce, brother.
They just don't reproduce, man. That's
Right.
it. That's all I have to say.
Yeah, if these guys debate, all they need to do is get one slide right in the middle in big bold text. Cars don't reproduce.
Right.
We give our 20-minute opening talk, give plenty of evidence, and then their rebuttal is 5 seconds. They just flash that image. Cars don't reproduce. They're good to go, right?
Yeah,
Creation demolished.
Yeah.
All right, here we go, brother.
Ballpark, which if you extrapolate that backwards, like I showed you earlier in this video, that gets you to approximately, a young Earth timeline for your mitochondrial most recent common ancestor. For the
I like how he admitted.
It's funny. Yeah, exactly. But now he's going to try and split. You got to look at the long-term accumulation rate. Dan, observed rate approximates fixation rate for all the reasons I explained, basic population genetics. But it's funny, even if we were to just go with a real strict number, let's say the numbers line up with, 7 or 8,000 or 9,000, still nowhere near the 100 or 200,000 that they need. So it's all right where, plus or minus a little bit, where we need it to be.
And imagine if this was reversed and we were like, so what, the mutation rate is landing on 300,000 years ago. You're not taking into account the assumed fast rate that we might find is true. They would have a field day with us. They'd be like,
Right.
what? You don't have any evidence for that. I'd be like, well, we don't, but we could if you view it like this.
It's
See
like
what I
anything.
mean?
Well, it's rescue device after rescue device. We put out an article, and we've been working on a paper for probably about 3 weeks now. Hopefully we'll have it done in the next month. Radiocarbon revelations, where we address all the rescue devices, the contamination rescue devices, both in lab and environment, the rescue device that other nearby nuclear material can recharge, things like diamonds. They would love, imagine we did go out and we searched every layer of the geologic column, Matt, for radiocarbon, and yet we found none. It was just all decayed away. Because again, if every single atom in the universe were made of radiocarbon, it all would have decayed away in less than 500,000 years, right? But yet we find radiocarbon in coal, we find radiocarbon in diamonds, we find radiocarbon in fossils, everywhere where we shouldn't find it if the earth is old. But could you imagine it was in reverse, that us creationists did go out and we did not find any detectable levels of, or maybe just like a tiny little bit that actually could be chalked up to contamination? The evolutionists would love that. See, that's why there's no radiocarbon, because the earth is billions of years old and there has been enough time for it to decay away, right? But the fact we find radiocarbon, well, they don't tap out. They just come up with their excuses. So no evidence is ever going to be evidence for a young earth to them, right, Matt?
Yeah, and they have the audacity to say, all you guys do is use God of the gaps. I'm like, wait a minute. Have you looked at the evolution of the gaps? There's more of those than ever for God of the gaps. We have far more answers than they would like us to even have. I don't know why they don't want us to even have answers. Isn't that perplexing? People that ask us questions don't want
They're
answers.
not looking
like,
for an answer.
What in the world? I'm so confused. See, when I started doing this, I thought, oh, it's going to be really cool to be an apologist because I like science, and the critics are all about science. They wear science as on their t-shirt. They label themselves as science as their God. So I'm thinking, cool, I'm going to learn the science so good in this area that I can share the evidence and they'll love it. And in reality, you find out that they either don't like science much or they like it so much it's their religion and they hate that you're actually answering it.
Those are your militant evolutionists that are highly invested or involved in their science fiction religion cult. But the majority of people, especially in our personal lives, I mean, you give them answers. I talk to people frequently in my personal life. Like if I'm at the gym and someone has a question and I give them an answer, they might kind of be on the fence, but they typically respond like, okay, that makes sense. Because the majority of people are not like the 0.1% of these militant atheists that we deal with online. It's very rare that you'll actually meet a Dan Stern Cardinal or an Aaron Ra or a Matt Dillahunty in your personal life, in your daily walk. No, we're dealing with the most militant, God-hating, creation-hating atheists on the planet, basically. That's why they're so invested. They go and make YouTube channels. So I'm not surprised that people like Dan are not accepting the answers. We're demolishing their challenges to show those in the audience, to show those on the fence, to show those that are actually objective that, hey, they've asked questions, they put forth challenges. They're not going to tap out. They're not going to admit defeat. We're not expecting that. But we have answered their challenges. And then most people that are actually somewhat objective in their thinking processes, they're going to say, okay, that's a fair point. That's a good answer. Then they're going to move on with their lives, right? But these guys, no, they're going to fight it to their death.
Well, they have their money comes from that, right? Which is, his job is literally on the line. Could you imagine saying, sorry, I believed a lie and taught it to kids for 3 decades?
Yeah. He's going to go to work the next day. I'm not related to a banana plant. No, that's not going to happen.
No, they need it to be true.
They're doing similar things using these two papers. These are the two that Jeanson cites in his Answers Research Journal article. It's also the two that he leans on in Traced, his book from just a couple of years ago. Now, these are Y chromosome rather than mitochondrial DNA papers, so the numbers are going to be different, but we're using the same basic approach, right? So you've got the creationists are looking at single generation pedigrees to extract the single generation mutation rate. And this is just an excerpt from the Jeanson paper that uses these two studies. He says 24 Dutch father-son pairs, 6 Estonian father-son pairs, right? It's all about.
What? Another deal one?
What I wanted to get from Dan's video is the mitochondrial genome ones. So let me kind of skip
That's
a little
the
bit.
kind of the key. Two
That's the
numbers
most
you could get from this.
right here, right
And
here.
again, we're using the creation back to the Earth
King
timeline
et
is
al.
about cases hundreds
Connell,
of years. And
or
oops,
okay, here
the
we go.
thing
The
that links all of
multi-generational
these papers
studies.
is that the studies the creationists ignore are multi-generation pedigree
Can you
studies.
hear? Is the audio coming in?
There's still directly observed mutation accumulation rates, just like creationists say
Matt,
we
you can
all
hear?
use.
Yes,
They
yes, I
go
hear.
back multiple generations, in some cases hundreds of years. And oops, they all show a slow mutation accumulation
Yeah, and we'll see why. We'll see who's really cherry picking, right, Matt?
rate. So I'm going to show you some examples, and these papers are linked down below, so you can check them out yourself if you want. These are mitochondrial DNA pedigree studies, and remember, the fast rate that creationists like, that you have to use to get to your young Earth timeline, is about 1 mutation for every 6 generations.
Fast rate equals fixation rate, Dan.
So we can look at this 1998 paper, Sudyal et al. This is looking at the Tristan da Cunha lineage. That island was uninhabited until 18.
Sudiel et al., King et al., Connell, Soares, or Soares. We're going to let him speak a little bit, but I do want to show real quick to the audience that these papers that are praised as debunking the young Earth creation time frame, this is a longer one. If you go to refuting Dr. Dan's premature criticism, he has not responded to this one. I go through every single one of these papers, one by one. The Norfolk Island use, Tristan da Cunha diversion, King et al., the Soares. I have an entire appendix on that. Soares et al. Is that Soares or Soares et al., Matt?
I pronounce it Soares.
Soares et al. The Canary Islands. Anyways, so point is, we've responded in detail, but we also want to give a video response too. So let's allow him to make a couple more points, and then we're just going to dismantle this.
16, and we can trace current inhabitants back to those founding members. That study found about 1 mutation every 36 generations. Then we have King et al. 2014, identification of the remains of King Richard III. So we are now going back to the 1400s. We have 2 living descendants, and it's a total of 36 generations going back in that.
I think people listening objectively are already seeing the problem with Dan's points here.
Mitochondrial lineage from King Richard III. And just coincidentally, it works out to the same 1 mutation for 36 generations in that study. And then a more recent one that I really like, Connell et al. 2022. This is looking at the Norfolk Island population. And there's kind of 2 numbers you could get from this. And again, we're using the creationist methodology here, looking at how many mutations, how many pedigree generations did they look.
Connell et al. For those wondering, et al. Means and others. So in a nutshell, I want to address these, Matt, and then I know you got some slides and visuals, so feel free to go to town, okay? As we've shown, Matt, as you discussed, Parsons, Howell, Santos, even Connell et al. Actually shows that pedigree-derived mutation rates are all very fast, 0.5 to roughly 0.1 per generation. And I would say that's conservative. In my work, in my research, I'm using a 0.1 mutation rate, and it's biblical time. We get the numbers we want. Okay, that's real time, direct, empirical. Dan's papers, well, largely assumption driven, but focusing on island populations. The Tristan paper, the Norfolk study, tiny, inbred, quirky populations. Okay, of course, the numbers are anomalies. This is not global representation. Okay, it's a bad sample, and I've written a section using an analogy to explain this better that I'll show the audience in a second. King et al. That's one of Dan's favorites, right? But that's circular, and what it also does is it stretches variation. So even with ones we could agree with, like we agree with this settlement, for example, yeah, it's within younger time frame. But it would be taking a bad sample that's not a good global representative and then expanding that variation, stretching it across deep time. That's where their assumptions come into play. Because he'll say, well, there are no assumptions here. Yeah, the fact you take the slow rate it's slow for obvious reasons. So it's not a good global representation. And then since you assume deep time evolution, then you stretch the slow rate to get an overall slow substitution rate. These studies are simply not good global representations, especially island populations, right? Isolated, inbred. Of course, you're going to get slower. But the one thing, his D-loop excuse that he likes to make, okay, that, well, Parsons was D-loop. It's a control region. It's going to be different outside of it. But we've talked about that. That's an outdated argument from Dan. Parsons wasn't alone. Whole genome pedigrees have actually confirmed the same rates. Fatuma, very highly respected evolutionary scientist himself, has explained that per generation rate approximates fixation rate. And so fast pedigrees plus fast fixation is biblical time. And that's why Dan has to repeat these same studies that we've addressed thoroughly. Matt, go ahead, brother. What are your overall responses on these studies one by one?
And when they do try to slow those rates down, what do they get? I actually found a great visual right here showing Hare et al. She did a deep-rooted pedigree germline mutation rate on European people. Wanted to find out, when did that haplogroup form? When did the Europeans branch off? For us, that would be Japheth. When did his line form? She tested the hypervariable region 1 and region 2 and got 2 different dates, and then combined the 2 to find out when the most recent common ancestor was. And again, 200 to 400 generations ago, right? That's when these went back. That's like not very far, you know? I mean, I'm sorry, 200 to 400 years. Those are long, deep-rooted pedigrees. And yet, what did Howell get? Do you remember? His mutation rate in 2003 showed it was 10 times faster than the phylogenetic mutation rate based on evolution. That's the biblical timeline. So when he's saying these aren't deep-rooted, they're plenty deep-rooted. Then we find they also exist in animals. This is what destroys him, everyone. See, if these only existed in humans where he could point to, well, what about that study? It shows it really slow. And there's a study over here that's really slow. Remember, everyone, we only needed one study with one mutation rate that's accurate, that's good science, that points to our timeline, and we can explain it. That's what we need to do. In science, can we explain the diversity of life on Earth based on the observable, testable, repeatable data? We can. He doesn't like it, so he points to studies that say, like, well, look, those don't. Who cares if they don't? We're not talking about Amish people. Did Amish people get off the ark? No, they didn't, did they? Shocker. So guess what? When you find a little island population that doesn't agree with a general overall theme, who cares? It doesn't matter. We don't need to explain them. You know, we know that there's going to be different groups of people that are mutating at different rates. Can we explain it? Yes, we can. Case closed. Can we explain it in animals? Yeah. Well, guess what? Okay, are you going to complain about animals too? Because guess what? We have deep-rooted chicken studies that go back 50 generations. Natural selection, purifying selection clearly would kick in after just 10 or 11. Well, that's what he's saying, right? You got to take in deep-rooted pedigrees or else you can't look at it. Well, 50 generations, that's plenty for you. Guess what? Their most recent common ancestor, guess when it lived? Same time as humans. Ooh, shocker. So guess what? It doesn't do anything. So he's gaslight. He's change the subjects and say, look at this little study over here. Ignore all that. Ignore it. It's garbage. You need to focus on this one thing. Don't you guys understand science?
He knows his uninformed audience are just going to blindly believe it. That's a big reason.
It's nonsense. It's stupid.
Yeah, keep going.
Take the whole thing, gather all the data, and what does it point to? What are you going to see? It's showing you the constant theme. Everything's pointing to a particular region. It's showing you that math, language, writing systems all show up at the exact same time. And the mutations rate, you take it, when do haplogroups form? Same time. You can trace these things back, and the whole story emerges really, really well. And then you take that.
But have you considered, Matt? Cars don't reproduce.
Oh my gosh. That's what we're up against. Who cares, right? Exactly. Cars don't reproduce. Forget about the animal studies. Don't look at those. We're talking about humans.
Wait a minute. He makes a response. We respond back. Then he makes a community post asking why we're obsessed.
Yeah. Why are we the bad guys? Victim
obviously,
card.
Dan has taken a class in psychological gaslighting, but it ain't going to work on us. It might work on his audience. and those that are as invested as Dan is in believing that they're related to strawberries and banana plants, but it is not going to work on anybody with even a little bit of objective thinking in their bodies. Matt, anyways, keep going, brother. I had to throw that in there, but keep going. This is good.
No, it's just the reality is you can look at a study and show that there's a small population that's mutating slower. That's fine. That's wonderful. Go believe that that's the reality of the entire world. The fact is we find the fast mutation rates in humans. We find it in animals. We find it in deep-rooted pedigrees of animals, and they all confirm a biblical timeline. I don't care that if you don't like it. That doesn't matter. The fact is we can explain it. You cannot from an evolutionary standpoint. Case closed. It's really just that simple. You can convolute it because you don't like it, but guess what? Science doesn't care what you think. We have our goal here is to be able to explain the data from a biblical timeline to see if it confirms it. Is it true? That's why we're young Earth creationists. If we woke up tomorrow and the entire data that we've been looking at is 100% wrong, guess what? We're wrong. But I don't know why everything keeps lining up so perfectly with our predictions. Clearly, the model is pretty good if we keep predicting things and they keep coming true. I mean, what about the newest study that just came out, right? I like this one. It's 2024. Helgeson et al., a group of people that in 2024 did a paper published on Cell, and they looked at a massive amount, 2,543 maternal lineages, 64,000 Icelanders, provided 116,000 mother-to-child transmissions, going all the way back. This is huge. They got the same results as Parsons. So remember, they're trying to say, oh, well, Parsons is old. That's what he tried to do. Oh, that's a 90s study. It's real old. They didn't know anything like we do today. We're so much better in science now. We're 30 years later. We won't be able to repeat it. We just repeated it with better technology. So again, I'm not really concerned about these little trivial studies that are just complaining. We can look to animals, and that alone solves the problem. Do we see it in animal life? And how come the most recent common ancestor of animals lands on when there was a biblical timeline of a flood recently and a reset in genetic bottleneck? Even the scientists are confused. Like, why did anchovies and sardines go through a global bottleneck with all land life? Nothing makes any sense for that. An asteroid, but that would clearly leave evidence for happening 6,500 years ago. How about an ice age, right? They said, well, maybe the ice age did it. Well, that's not going to kill every living species, 90% of them. 90% of species dying from an ice age 6,500 years ago. Come on, these things don't match their model. There's nothing in their model to explain why that could happen. And when you run the numbers yourself, you can easily do it. You can type AI right now and go on to ChatGPT and run your own simulation model. Say, what's the probability that going back in time 6,500 years ago, we could get a most recent common ancestor, and just say, what was the world's population back then? And it'll tell you, it'll make up some number, and it'll say the probability of it happening, though, is literally absolutely zero, because you have isolated islands. You have Australia that's been supposedly isolated for 60,000 years. How in the world did they have our most recent common ancestor with the rest of the world's population matching the exact same if they weren't even in contact with us yet? Doesn't even make sense. Our model can explain it, and it explains it easily. The evolutionary model just has to go, oh, well, but it's an anomaly. It's a paradox. We'll figure it out one day because evolution's still true. Don't worry about it. Oh, yeah, that's real good science. Ignore the data because it doesn't align with that way of thinking. Now, I could understand if you've never heard these things before because you were like me and you were indoctrinated going into school with only believing in evolutionary theory. Then you get outside of that and your job's with evolution. Sure, that's fine. It's totally acceptable. I understand why you believe in evolution. But when you come across the information that shows you, wow, these things actually aren't very good. These explain the paradoxes that we have. These answer the predictions that were made from them. I think I found a better model. We can explain the diversity of life. You see what happened? Here's how to easily refute evolution with this, everyone. We say that mutation rates were fast. We find that they are fast. Evolution predicted that they'd be slow, and they were not slow. If evolution predicted one thing and we found the opposite, then their entire thing falls apart because evolution is based on mutations. If they got that wrong, everything else below that falls apart. So we're making predictions that are accurate and testable, and we make challenges to anybody that actually wants to debate against this. Like, okay, if you think your model is so good, make predictions. We'll challenge that prediction. No one's taken Nathaniel Jensen up on that predictive power, by the way. And he said, choose any animal. I don't even care what it is. And we'll run the study ourselves at the Answers in Genesis Research Center. Or we can have another laboratory that's more secular do it in case they're worried. No one will do it. No one will do it. They don't want to have the answers. So if we're saying it's fast and evolution is finished, because we need to explain the diversity of life. There's a very little bit of diversity in all life anyway. But if we can say, hey, look, this got there from rapid mutations, their entire timeline is shot. See, they rely more on the radiometric dates than they do the observable rates. Now, if I was going to tell you, how old is life? Aren't you going to want to test life? Why would you go test a rock? That's what they would rather do. They would rather test something else because that something else agrees with their timeline, because that's what they're basing their timeline on. It's circular reasoning. We know things are old because that's when we dated those rocks to those things. So when we look, we go, crocodiles are obviously that old because we've tested those rocks and that's when they lived during that time period. So then you go and test an alligator or a crocodile and they don't date to that age. They date much younger on a biblical time frame. So which one is going to be true? We say test the life to determine how old life is. If everything went through a bottleneck recently, we should be able to test life that went through a bottleneck recently. That's what we see. It's really just that simple. And there's no reason to convolute it. So I think that if you can take the dates out of your mind for those radiometric dates of rocks and just view the evidence of the fossil record, you would see that it represents what you would expect to find if there was a global flood. Now, the dates makes it really confusing because it's like, well, why would it give such a date if it is young? And we can answer that. And we answer that from a different perspective, of course, because, again, we go to the observable evidence. We like to go to the Proton 21 laboratories. Of course, they're closed now, but there's another laboratory that's open now. I think it's called Sapphire, the Sapphire Project. And what they do is when they create radioactive elements, they form in the ratios and proportions that we see them today, not as they would have been billions of years ago. So I really like that. That's what we're doing with these mutation rate studies. We go, okay, well, how old is humanity? We get a date. We go, okay, it seems to be around 200 to 400 generations ago. We get the most recent common ancestor for Eve, the mother of all living. Okay, that's pretty good. That's biblical timeline. So what about animals then? We find the same thing. That's pretty crazy. I mean, I'm not generation wise because every animal is going to have different generation times, but I'm talking about the time frame of a very recent bottleneck. Now, what's bottlenecking all animal life? It doesn't make sense in the evolutionary model. So I'm going to choose testing life to determine when life arose and when life went through a bottleneck. That makes the most sense to me, not testing the rocks. So,
Matt, that was incredible. As our brother Bluey in the live chat says, you were on point. And that was good because I needed a restroom break. My endurance isn't as good as it usually is. I've literally been sneezing and blowing my nose for like 24 hours straight. So
dang.
if I'm sniffling throughout, appreciate the patience. That was great, Matt. And will we get any kind of sophisticated engagement on the actual science? I highly doubt it. But here's the math. It works out just as you said, Matt. And this is why it's a great time to be a biblical creationist, because we don't have to run to rescue devices. We don't have to invoke rescue mechanism after rescue mechanism. And so here's from my article titled, "The Mitochondrial Clock is Running and it Runs on Biblical Time." So do check this out. This is the initial foundational study. And then Dan attempted a rebuttal and failed, of course. Anyways, for clarity and simplicity, these calculations begin at the flood 4,500 years ago and extend to the present. The pre-flood period is intentionally left for a future, more technical treatment because of longer human lifespans and whatnot. But regardless, it still works out is the point. Anyways, conservative and transparent. That's what I wanted to be. Conservative, because then really like the real numbers, if it's a little higher, let's say in terms of mutation rate, then it's only going to be easier to explain. Time since the flood, 4,500 years. Generation time, roughly 25 years. Range 20 to 30. Generations since the flood, 180 range, 150 to 225. The pedigree rate that we've gone with, whole genome equivalent, 0.5 to 0.1. So very conservative central value. Founders at the flood, 3 maternal lineages, right? We got those 3 major haplogroups, L, M, and N, that they have not sufficiently engaged. I put in an article responding to potential counters, possibly differing by a few substitutions, core calculation. Okay, so you can go through this, sensitivity checks, interpretation, all of that. And anyways, after all the numbers are considered, the biblical creation model, beginning with the flood as a genetic reset point, explains modern mitochondrial DNA diversity, 20 to 30 average, 130 to 40 maximum. Within 4,500 years, no deep time assumptions required. Evolution has been absolutely dismantled. Okay, I've been thinking about this model for between 2 and 3 years now, since I published Fixation Equilibrium, a technical article with Chris Root, peer-reviewed, looked over by Dr. John Sanford. So that's been a long time in the making. Here, based on everything you're saying, what I've said in a nutshell, Dan, demographic distortion is what Dan's looking to, right, Matt? It doesn't work. Right. This would be an analogy. This is what Dan is focusing on, rather than the real raw empirical data. That's a good global representation. Think of mutations like grocery store items arriving each week. Big supermarket equals global population. Shelves fill quickly. Diversity accumulates at the true incoming rate. Tiny corner store. This is what Dan focuses on, right, Matt? A tiny corner store. There's his island population right there. Shelves are few and turnover is high. Items are lost like drift or never accumulate in large numbers. If you only measured the corner store, you'd think the business has been running for much longer than it really has. Hence, Dan's incredibly slow substitution rate, right, Matt? Because the shelves look sparse. That's exactly what happens when scientists use tiny isolated groups to infer global mutation rates. You know, Dan's still on step 1. He's still at first base. Well, we've already hit a home run. Or maybe we'll make it a little lighter. We're at third base, you know, on our way home. And Dan, he's not really engaging in any meaningful manner, unfortunately.
He's going to say, you realize that there's cars parked outside that grocery store analogy, right?
Yeah, that's true. And we know cars don't reproduce. Dan figured that out. He had to get a PhD to figure it out, but he figured it out. That's all that matters.
Mm-hmm.
So remember this, mutations are like cars entering a highway. Each generation, 0.1 cars. There's akin to mutations drive on. Some crash instantly, deleterious. Others keep driving, right? Nearly neutral and neutral. Eventually one reaches the end, fixation. Critics obsess over the journey of one car, but population genetics teaches something bigger, the traffic flow. This is what Dan misses. If 0.1 cars enter per generation, 0.1 cars finish per generation. That's throughput. Fixation equals or approximates mutation rate. Observe pedigree. This is how simple it is, Matt. Observe pedigree is fast. We've demonstrated that. Okay, his D-loop excuse doesn't work. It's outdated. Parsons wasn't alone in the matter. Whole genome pedigrees confirm the same fast mutation rates. Mutation rate approximates fixation rate. What are we looking at? Mitochondrial DNA diversity in 4,500 years. Okay, I think we've spent enough time on creation myths. We've bombarded him with creation facts. Do you want to now move into our other favorite Dan? Simon Dan?
Let's do it.
Okay, let's do it. Just looking at the chat real quick.
Oh, yeah. Do we have any questions associated with that topic?
Yeah, let's see. Lynn Mitzi, my sister. Hope you're having as much fun as we are. Good health vibe sent. Appreciate that. Matt is on point. Amen. Okay, Man Dan. This one's funny. We're going to have some fun with this one. I'm pretty happy with that. 1 hour and 40 minutes, and we got through, I think, the most technical aspects of this program, the hardest. Now we get to sit back and have a more relaxing time engaging with what Simon Dan has to say here. And
Somebody said this
might-
doesn't. Oh, sorry. So somebody said this doesn't point to special creationism. The timeline does. That's why we take mutation rates and we accumulate. We count how many mutations there are total, and then we go backwards in time following that mutation rate to when the Bible says Adam would have been created, and that points to the biblical timeline. That's what we're doing here. And some of the animals, of course, are going to go back to Noah's flood because they would have been unclean animals. So therefore, their mitochondria would have been set at that bottleneck. So that's what we're showing. We're showing the biblical timeline and how it refutes the evolutionary timeline, what we were taught in school, because obviously you would go back much further in time and not all animals would be bottlenecked, right? Clearly something alive on this earth should go back hundreds of thousands or even a million years. Like why alligators and crocodiles, like why are they harmed in a bottleneck? Clearly they wouldn't be. These are like living dinosaurs. And yet there they are, bottlenecked along the side of everything else on life and has low genetic diversity. Doesn't make sense with how fast the mutation rate is. So that's why we're talking about those.
Great point. You got to love when they resort to that, because so they're not able or capable. They don't have the ability to actually engage the points we're making.
Oh, how does any of this show that humans are not apes? Ooh.
Yeah.
Okay, we can go down genetic boundaries. We can show homology. I guess think about whatever question you want, and we'll come back to that, because how does it show separate ancestry? We can show you genetic boundaries that do that, and a study that you can read right now that shows you that very thing as well. I actually don't know if it's up on the website, but it's done. We can go over that as well. Genetic boundaries.
Well, Lorraine was asking earlier about migration after the flood with kangaroos and marsupials. And I thought to myself, wait a minute, you just published a paper on that.
Yeah, great timing. Yes, we're going to have everything on paper. So yes,
exactly. So again, those that want to help us expand truth and research and copy it over, including adding other stuff as well, making it more thorough, onto truthandresearch.com. And it's on your heart to help support us. Let's make that happen. I think that'd be awesome. Okay, here we go. Simon Dan. I like the way he starts it off, Matt. I think this is your first time listening to this, actually.
Yeah.
Therefore, I think you're going to get a kick out of this part.
Okay.
Over the years that the young Earth creation, it's become apparent to me over the years that.
Okay, something's become apparent to Simon Dan over the years. Over the years. So it took him years to realize something. Let's see what it is.
The young Earth creationists are very much in favor of dinosaurs living with humans in the past.
Really?
Did you learn that?
That young Earth that would be like me saying this. It's become very apparent over the years that evolutionists truly believe that humans and chimpanzees are related through common ancestry.
Crazy.
No, the creation model heavily, I don't want to say relies, but holds to a position that says everything goes back about 6,000 years. That would include dinosaurs and humans. But apparently it took our good friend Simon Dan a few years, several years at least, to finally realize, oh, creationists are arguing that humans and dinosaurs coexist. Is that wild?
He's probably going to have a whole new series now coming out, because
now that it's finally dawned on him like a light bulb going off. Hey, wait a minute. Those pesky creationists, they believe humans and T-Rex.
Yeah.
I would love for Simon Dan to quote unquote debunk our many programs on dinosaur soft tissue and collagen and proteins and blood vessels found in dinosaur fossils. How were those preserved for 65 million years?
This is, of course, nonsense. We've got.
Well, that's an assertion, Simon Dan. I'm not sure if he's ever, if it's just becoming apparent now, then I'm assuming he's never really done any kind of sophisticated analysis of the preserved bio material that we find in dinosaurs. I'm just making that prediction, Matt.
Strong evidence to suggest that dinosaurs are around tens of millions of years before humans ever were. But one.
The sound is coming in good, Matt?
Yes.
Okay.
Creationist YouTuber thinks that problem has been solved. Hello all and welcome along to another episode of Tinfoil Tuesday with me, Simon Dan. Thanks very much for joining me. Right, on with today's video then, which comes from Standing for Truth. They have a guest on who can apparently solve the problem of humans and dinosaurs living together in the past. Here we go.
I think there's enough there to give us good reason to believe that man and dinosaurs coexisted. Now, one of the largest challenges, one of the biggest challenges that evolutionists will put forth, or anti-young earth creationists, they'll say, okay, well, if man and dinosaur coexisted and man lived alongside dinosaurs, why don't we find dinosaurs and humans buried together in the flood layers, in the rocks?
This is a very good question. Let's see what the guest says.
Bodhi, what's a good response to that?
You know, I wrote a whole chapter on that. And I also have an article on my website dealing just with that subject. But here's the easy answer. We also don't find humans buried with crocodiles. We also don't find humans buried with coelacanths, which are alive today.
This is just a dodge. Humans and crocodiles overlap in time. Both are alive today. The reason we don't find them fossilized together has nothing to do with the fact they're not existing at the same time period. It's because fossilization is rare and highly dependent on environment. Fossils form when very specific conditions are met. Rapid burial, the right sediment, the right chemistry, which means that most creatures that die don't fossilize at all. But when it comes to dinosaurs and humans, the issue isn't rarity.
It's funny because he accused us of dodging, and yet he himself ended up dodging. And so I want to go over a few of his points here.
I'll be right back. Restroom time for me.
Yeah, take your time, brother. And so the coelacanth argument reminds me of how Dr. Dan dodged coelacanth. And so they resort to these explanations when it benefits them, but when creationists use the same point, that, for example, okay, coelacanth. If we ask the question, why aren't humans and dinosaurs found in the same layer? Okay, well, wait a minute. Coelacanths were thought to be extinct. We lose them in the fossil record, according to their model, roughly 65 million years ago. So they've existed all this time, though, because we discovered them recently in 1938, swimming in the oceans today. So I guess they didn't go extinct. But wait a minute. Why don't we find coelacanths and whales, or coelacanths and humans buried in the same layers, buried as fossils together? And then what they'll do is they'll look to, well, they lived in different habitats or ecological zonations, even though whales and dolphins and coelacanths all live in the ocean. But anyways, it doesn't rescue evolution. For example, Dan, when he attempted this, Dr. Dan himself admits whales and coelacanths aren't found fossilized together because they lived in different habitats. That's exactly what our model says. And the model that I put forth is that the pre-flood world would have been broken down into different regions with its own various sets of biodiversity, including plants and animals. And so when the flood took place over that year, then regions were buried, region after region. Okay, but yes, we do still find a little bit of overlap because we find out of order fossils, mixed environments. There's some interesting cases like the Ashley phosphate beds. Dan can speak to that. He just conceded the core point. Absence of co-burial is best explained by regional separation, not by evolutionary deep time. And Simon Dan's argument is more so just rhetoric. He himself admits that fossilization is rare, selective, and environment dependent. But then he goes and demands that we have to find humans, let's say, in the same layers as dinosaurs. Fossilization is rare and selective. Key point recap. It favors marine life, not mobile humans fleeing disaster. I have a couple points I want to make here, but I want to allow Simon Dan to continue what he's saying. Matt, let me know when you're back, brother.
It's total absence. In hundreds of thousands of fossil sites worldwide, with billions of catalogued specimens, not a single human fossil has ever been found in the same undisturbed layers as non-avian dinosaurs. If they coexisted, we'd expect at least one example. So their crocodile and coelacanth examples actually backfires, because we do find evidence of modern animals alongside humans in recent sediments as expected. What we never find is humans alongside dinosaurs. And that complete absence is exactly what you do.
It's so funny. Simon Dan admits coelacanths, for example, overlapped with whales, sharks, and even humans. Yet those fossils are never found together either. Why? Because fossilization is rare and habitat dependent. Even Dan admits this, to explain why we don't find creatures like coelacanths and let's say whales together. And that's exactly what I'm arguing in the pre-flood biome hypothesis that I've now published 3 articles, 1 foundational article. The second one addressed challenges like plankton and shark teeth and so on and so forth. Then I just published one this morning responding to Dr. Dan Stern-Cardy now. Okay. The Bible's clear, Matt. Human population was smaller than animal populations, right? God creates 2 people, Adam and Eve, and then he creates populations of animals in fully working and functioning ecosystems, all put in their own specific regions. Okay. And so that would make fossilization of humans far less likely than what we would find in terms of the worldwide prevalence of various animals. Okay. So Matt, anything you want to add, brother?
I was just saying, it sounds pretty obvious. If human beings are created on a single continent that's the size of all of the continents put together, they live in one area. They only exist for 1,500 years. We already have a slow generation time, and then they don't even immediately start reproducing and filling the earth, right? I mean, they wait like over 100 years to even have a child, and then what do? They migrate to the east. They only migrate in one direction, so we have a very small population. And then there's a global flood. Obviously, the location that humans are living in aren't worldwide, because how could Noah warn them of a global flood coming? It makes sense that it's logical that all of humanity was in a fairly similar small area on an entire earth. So what are they living around? Obviously, Adam was placed in a garden, and God had to bring animals to him because there weren't animals already there for him to name. So obviously mankind was already removed from most of animal life. And then when they left Eden, they went to the east. So, I mean, we have a small population living in one part of the world, and we have animals that fill up the rest of the world. So, I mean, seems to me logical that you wouldn't find most creatures with human beings in the fossil record. So. Oh, I don't hear you.
There we go. You can hear me?
Yes.
Rather than just focusing on the coelacanth challenge, I put out an article that Dr. Dan skipped: plankton, sharks, and living fossils, how the pre-flood biome model crushes the challenges. And so I'll share screen. I went through several additional instances where we find creatures that evolutionists agree live together, but are not necessarily found together. So there's a whole appendix in this one. Let's see. Or perhaps it was, there's a few different articles. So let's see. Oh, this one. We're model building. This is model building in real time, right? And so the coelacanth, Dan, he appeals. Isn't it funny how they appeal to ecological zonation when it benefits them? But if creationists use a similar argument and consistently, then suddenly they don't like it. So right here, crocodiles, it's double standard. Crocodiles and dinosaurs. Evolutionists say crocodiles lived alongside non-avian dinosaurs for over 100 million years. Yet despite this alleged overlap, they are rarely found fossilized in the same context. This fits perfectly with the pre-flood biome model, different ecosystems separated by geography. And then I use an analogy that works beautifully with our model that says God created man in his image, right? And part of that would be creativity. Man designs modes of transportation, but also writes stories and builds these immersive worlds like Lord of the Rings or Pokemon, one of the most popular phenomenons of our day. And it just so turns out that in the world of Pokemon, you actually have different regions, distinct regions like Kanto, Johto, okay, Sinnoh, with its own unique sets of creatures and very little overlap. Is that interesting? And so the pre-flood world, what we see, was also divided into these biogeographical regions. And so organisms are specially created to fit those environments. And because of this separation, okay, you can turn the geologic column horizontal rather than vertical. And now you're looking at different regions, different communities, Cambrian communities, Ordovician communities, Jurassic communities, right? With very little overlap. And so when they're buried, when they're transported, they're largely buried according to those various regions. But then what we also find, Matt, like you like to talk about, out of place fossils, that also fits with the model because there at times can be some overlap. But we also know, for example, we've had geologists on like John Mackay that talk about when they're out in the field and they're looking at fossils, they find mixed environments, sharks mixed with plants, mixed with land animals. And so all of this taken into consideration points to a global flood and points to this regional world model where we have a nice analogy, but it also fits the data. And it's a double standard because, again, well, why don't we really find dinosaurs and humans together in the same layers? Okay, well, we can say the same thing about ginkgo trees and flowering plants, mammals and dinosaurs, right? Notice this. Evolutionists once taught mammals evolved after dinosaurs. For the most part, they'd say, well, there's these small little mammals. But now mammals are so prevalent in the dinosaur layers, right? So they had to admit that various kinds of mammals coexisted with them. Their fossil separation is easily explained by biome distinctions, not time. The absence of co-burial does not prove absence of coexistence. Fossilization is selective and regional, just as the coelacanth proved evolutionists wrong when rediscovered alive in 1938. These other cases further demonstrate that the pre-flood biome hypothesis offers a consistent, testable explanation for the fossil record. Matt, Dr. Dan gave some challenges in his video showing circular reasoning, but also showing that he misunderstands the model. For example, notice this. Dr. Dan Stern Cardinal asks, how did trilobites stay under Jurassic or Cretaceous biodiversity? Answer, they weren't staying under, they were simply buried first. Later deposits stacked over them like pancakes. Flood flume experiments. We've had full programs. We had a conference a couple of years back with John Mackay and Joe Hubbard where we went through a lot of their own flume experiments. Prove layered strata can form rapidly from a single event. Stacked biodiversity is consistent with catastrophic deposition. Notice this. Early regions underneath. This was a major argument from Dan in his video last night. Cambrian trilobites are always at the bottom because the flood began in the oceans. Marine invertebrate regions were buried first. Then other biomes were successively buried as waters rose. Pokemon analogy, it works. If Kanto is flooded, right? Kanto has its own set of biodiversity, its own specific regions, and Johto has its own. So if Kanto's flooded before Johto, then of course Kanto fossils will lie beneath Johto fossils. It's order of burial, not evolution. So an important point that people need to understand is that it's not that these different creatures in the pre-flood world are living at different times. It's that they're living at the same time, but they're different in terms of space. So same time, but not the same space. And so when you understand, rather than real strict ecological zonation thinking, regional thinking, then you can explain these challenges. But anyways, Matt, was there anything you wanted to add to that, or should I continue Simon Dan's video, brother?
You might want to get to some questions. I think people had some on your Pokemon analogies.
Okay, well, let's continue a little bit more on Simon Dan, and then we'll address some questions.
All right. Oh, I don't hear him. I don't hear him.
Oh, re-screen sharing.
There you go.
Jose, appreciate it. Did you want to, Matt, for Scriptures and Stones, really quick, 'cause I know you've done some work on this. He's wondering, do you think Eden was in the Middle East region, or is it possible to tell? Impossible.
Yeah. I would say that it was not. One main reason why it would be, if there's a global flood, imagine if you made a boat yourself and you got on it and then the whole world flooded, the boat would go up and just stay there, even though the rotation of the earth, even though there's wind patterns, and the sea itself would have massive tides and then come right back down into the same region. I think what happened is the ark was built somewhere else when the continents were connected. I believe that it would be in a region that's today after the flood, where the Philippines were. And then obviously it landed in the Middle East, and they got off, and then they started naming local things that they saw pre-flood. So that's what confuses people. And that's why there's missing rivers. Like, you only find the Tigris and Euphrates, but the other two are missing, because they were just naming things after what they already knew, probably out of respect. And plus, that's how we name things. So I don't think it was the same general location. If you go to Young Earth Creation, I don't know where it's at on Donnie's channel, but if you go to the Quest series and look up the Quest for Eden, I go into massive amounts of detail, tracking it back scripturally and then on ancient maps going all the way back in time. And you'll be shocked at where I placed the location of Eden being. It shocked me.
I don't get these questions. It's like the critics are not listening to the model. So how small mammals begin? Well, begins an assumption. They don't just begin to appear. They're there. And the fact that we actually find these explosions of these creatures, like the Permian explosion, the Cambrian explosion, the fact that they do seem to suddenly appear in the sense that there's no evolutionary precursors, right? That would point back to the creation model, along with dinosaurs, but no humans. Humans were not living in the same regions as dinosaurs. Okay. And mammals, there's a variety of mammals, but some mammals are restricted to their own regions while other mammals are in their own regions. Okay. So this question, it's question begging. It's the same thing as asking, why aren't whales and coelacanths found together? Why aren't coelacanths and humans found together? We know they lived in the same time. Coelacanths are swimming around today, and so are human beings.
Yeah, you can also answer that in other ways. Look at the fossil record and you'll find lots of ghost lineages. These are animals like big cats that seem to arise out of nowhere. They just appear in the fossil record fully formed as large cats with no ancestor. Then we have Lazarus taxons. Those are things where we find an animal in the fossil record really deep in a layer. And then later in the higher layers, we find the exact same species, even though there was a gap of millions of years missing. What's going on? Did millions of years really pass without these animals dying? Or did a global flood perhaps lay down multiple layers as the other species were able to run higher before they were finally killed? And then we have disharmonious associations, which are typical examples of where we find cold adapted species like a mammoth with a warm-blooded species, something that we'd find like in Africa, and they sometimes get mixed together because of some type of like a dinosaur graveyard, right? Remember, the early stages of the flood would have been the most catastrophic because there would have been lots of earthquakes and subduction zones where you see lots of tsunamis. So that's when waves are hitting. That's when things are getting buried. That's when the trilobites are seen moving up through the different geologic layers, trying to survive as they crawl to higher ground. That's why we find footprints of organisms before we ever find the organisms themselves, because they're literally running from a flood. So that would be my answers.
Yeah, and we see a lot of the animal foot tracks before we actually see the animals themselves, showing that they were running from the floodwaters, and then eventually they were buried rapidly. And so, to kind of leave no stone on this issue with Simon Dan, I find it funny that he points out that fossilization is rare and selective. Yeah, very true. We do find marine life all throughout. Needle in a haystack problem. With billions of cubic miles of sediments, demanding at least one human plus dinosaur fossil is unrealistic, especially if they lived in completely different regions. And even if there was some overlap, there wouldn't be enough overlap to expect a ton of humans to be fossilized with dinosaurs. But then we do entire presentations, Matt, on the historical evidence for dinosaurs and man coexisting. We've done entire programs on Behemoth and also Leviathan. These historical accounts like Marco Polo and Alexander the Great and Herodotus. And you've done presentations on the depictions, art depictions of dinosaurs on cave walls and in Bell's Tomb, I think it's called, is another good one. And so obviously if they're drawing them, describing them, then they would have lived with them. The Chinese calendar has dragon on it. I mean, the word dinosaur wasn't invented until the 1800s, if I remember correctly. They were called something different prior to that. And the Bible talks about creatures that really do sound like dinosaurs, like Behemoth and also Leviathan. So that would be direct evidence. Okay. The model doesn't require overlap. The pre-flood biome hypothesis predicts general regional separation. Exceptions may exist, but they're not guaranteed to fossilize. Possible overlaps exist, right? So our model can account for some anomalies if they exist. The evolutionary model really can't have any anomalies. Isn't that right, Matt? If you think about it, the Ashley phosphate beds, it's controversial. There's not a ton of data on it, but you have put some study and work into it. And what did they discover in the Ashley phosphate beds? Why is that so controversial, Matt?
Ooh, let me show you. Let me show you, because this is really good. Francis S. Holmes was a very famous geologist and archaeologist at the time. And he went through and noted that there were lots of animals mixed with man and dinosaur. So he put a man and dinosaur on the cover of his book. So when people say there's no examples, there actually are. I can give my reasonings for why I think this is. But here's the amazing thing is they go, wow, how come we don't find any certain animals together? Well, we actually do. And this figure actually shows you a really good one of what they found. Hadrosaur dinosaur, Ichthyosaurus, Plesiosaurus mixed in with the Pleistocene with humans, giant sloth, and woolly mammoth all together. So this is an actual gigantic bed. The Ashley phosphate beds, these are popular in South Carolina, but they actually run from Florida all the way up into Canada. Now, this was mined completely for the phosphate. So they ended up grinding it all up into dust and selling it for the phosphate for farmers. Because if you put that on your soil, your plants grow really, really good. It loves phosphorus, NPK. Those are the things when you buy soil that you really need for your plants. So unfortunately, they actually ground up their evidence, which is crazy considering how amazing it was that they found all of these things together and they documented them. The Animals and Man Together is a book where they actually show all of these things together. So they documented the reptiles, the humans, what they found, jawbones, pottery, marine mammals. They found a lot all together in this, and they documented it. And this was at a time when he was actually worried. When they found the first human jawbone, they threw it into the river. They said, we're not going to lose our jobs because of this. But they kept finding things. So eventually they categorized it. Now, how I would explain this is a little bit different than probably most creationists, because I've been thinking a lot about this recently. And I would say that in the global flood, a lot of these things were killed and they were actually probably put into a dinosaur graveyard itself. And then later, when North America was flooded again from the Ice Age melt-off, they probably killed the humans that were in the area at the time because they found Native American pottery there. And that is what actually wash these into the single bed of phosphate that we actually have, because when you put them together, not a lot of fossils turn to phosphate, and every single fossil that was there was made of phosphate. So I'm thinking there might be a double flood evidence that we're looking at there, and that's probably why we find dinosaur and man together. I don't necessarily believe that they were probably living together because of the location of that. But I think that a flood probably put them together at one point, and then they fossilized and became the phosphorus that they later discovered. And that's just my 2 cents. But it is evidence that they are together in a single layer. The very thing that people literally.
Well, and the interesting part is we as creationists, especially from the regional world hypothesis, we can explain the so-called sorting of the fossil record, but we can also account for some anomalies where major anomalies like that, the evolutionary community would never be able to admit to it basically being factual. Like, for example, Howard F. here, who, if I understand correctly, is a geologist or sedimentologist or something. He says the Ashley Bed Book contains no photos or drawings of bones and no fossils deposited in any museum. What are your thoughts, Matt?
Well, they drew layers of rock, but this is back before they were probably taking photos, because I would imagine that if back then, how big cameras were. They didn't. I highly
You mean
doubt.
they didn't pull out their iPhone 12 and take some pictures?
Yeah, right. They weren't even there to investigate these types of things. They were there for the phosphate. So I highly doubted they actually even planned on looking for a human and a dinosaur. When they found it, they said, wow, this is amazing. So they documented it. I highly doubt they made it up, because their jobs would be on the line. Think about that. Why would you It's like people saying, I saw an alien. Well, you're just immediately going, everything else you say is discredited, man. I don't believe in aliens. You just sound like a crazy person. So why would you say it? You have to believe in it if you saw it, because otherwise you're just a clown. No one is going to believe you, right? So that, to me, putting your job on the line when you're the most famous geologist at the time just seems like a ridiculous thing to come up with and say, we found it. But what he documented was what he saw, and he said, we found Indian pottery and a human jawbone at the base of an ancient tree. And when we threw it in the river, we found more of them. We found so many that we finally started to document them. And we found hadrosaur dinosaur teeth right next to it. So dinosaur and man right next to each other in the same layer. And obviously they documented and said, okay, well, there's plenty of this. But here's the other thing. Take away dinosaur and take away man, you still have aquatic life with land life from major different ecological zones all together in graveyards. And these dinosaur graveyards are what we find in some areas of the world, like in Montana, gigantic graveyard there, right? Utah and Montana region. And then the other one would be this Ashley phosphate bed that runs up. They're rare, they're more anomalies, but it's really cool to see when ecological systems get pushed together from a flood. And you can see the mixture of all those creatures, because that would be what we would expect to see, at least in certain stages of the flood. And especially if the continents weren't very high. Both flood models predict very low continental size. I think around 5,000 feet elevation of a mountain right here that's 10,000. It's already double the mountain height of the highest pre-flood world continents. Now, I don't know what we can do with that, but that's fascinating to me, because it just shows you how different the world could have been and why things were probably more tropical in most regions. So amazing.
Well, and Scriptures and Stones, trying to find it, had a question to me. Let's see. Well, as I find it, I'll comment on that. From our position, the young Earth creation position, and then the pre-flood biome hypothesis, we can entertain anomalous examples like this and consider it, but evolutionists, obviously they can't even consider it because it's just completely outside of their paradigm. Here's the question: Scriptures and Stones. Matt, you can respond to this too. I'll start. Do you think trace fossils formed in lens bubbles of water in between rock layers? That is Walt Brown's idea, right? Matt, perhaps you can touch on Walt Brown's idea, but trace fossils. So that would be footprints, burrows, nests, I believe, raindrops. And so I would hold to Michael J. Ord's beds hypothesis. I think that, if I remember correctly, stands for briefly exposed diluvial sediments. And so basically what you'd have is periods of time during the flood where you would have sediments exposed. And during that time period, like let's say you, a preserved dinosaur egg nest. Well, the crust of the earth would basically be flexing up and down during the flood. You'd have parts of the earth uncovered for an extended period of time. It would vary. And then during those periods, you could have dinosaurs lay eggs. You could have a dinosaur leave a footprint. And then eventually the flood levels would rise and bury them and basically preserve them. And so that's it in a nutshell. Matt, what are your thoughts? Are you familiar with Walt Brown's idea on that?
Yeah, Walt Brown believes in lithification. So it's a earthquake type of a pattern happening at the early stages of the flood. And so therefore that would be forming most of the layers that are occurring, at least early on. He doesn't get too much into it, but I know that's his major hypothesis. The problem with that is you get rid of footprints by saying that it occurred for the entire duration. Like, could you imagine if there's an earthquake? Every time you put a footprint in the ground, let's say in sand, and there's an earthquake, it'll dissolve that footprint so you can no longer see them. We find dinosaur footprints, so clearly the earthquake occurring the entire time is not a valid argument. But at least in the early stages, sure, when the fountains of the Great Deep broke open, probably massive earthquakes, at least for a couple days. And then during any tsunami that would occur, again, you'd be getting an earthquake followed up. So what's happening is there are probably trace fossils that we use. And I have no problem with that, because when you look at the list of them, what do you see? You literally see them starting in the ocean, and you see non-mobile creatures moving to lightly mobile creatures, moving to lightly land-moving creatures. And it literally would explain how we would expect to find creatures and their survivability of a flood. Now, obviously, a trilobite running on land and finding it outside would be irrational. It would be like finding a rabbit in the Precambrian. Why would it be in the ocean? Is a rabbit out there on a little raft at the time? You know what I mean? And you find it right next to a trilobite. That would be so rare that, of course, we wouldn't expect to find it. So that's why your regional hypothesis makes sense, because you don't find rabbits hanging out with trilobites. That's why we don't find them together. So they're living in their environment, their ecosystem, and then flood hitting. Sure, there are going to be some areas where things are all buried together because of a tsunami. But animals, they can hear tsunamis coming, so they can feel them. They run. When there's an earthquake, a volcano, they know long before. So to be buried by a massive waves or tidal waves, it was so big they just couldn't get away, or they were down in valleys where it just filled up. That's why they find lots of dinosaurs without any of their young. Why? Because they ran away from their own young and they left them to die. They tried to survive and they still died all together in groups. And we find that scenario. Like I was saying, we find tracks before we find the dinosaurs themselves. We also find adult dinosaurs separated from their eggs and their young, because they literally just abandoned them to try to live.
Yeah, when the global flood struck, the rising waters essentially buried various regions with their specific set of biodiversity in succession, preserving them in the so-called geological column. So you'd have shallow marine Cambrian ecosystems. They're buried first, followed by higher, more diverse ecological regions, explaining why fossils appear in the order that they do. And so, for example, when Howard F. asked this question, how is the separation of these animal groups so complete? Okay, and pelycosaurs do not overlap with dinosaurs. Dinos don't overlap with cats. Again, why don't we find coelacanths and whales overlapped and buried in the same sediments? Why don't we find them together? Why don't we find coelacanths and humans? Again, he's not thinking through the regional hypothesis, where you'd have one region with its own set of creatures and plants, right? Some creatures would have non-flowering plants. Other regions would comprise flowering plants. Those are largely separated. Even evolutionists would agree with this. So it's like asking the same question. Well, if we were to take the Pokemon analogy, why don't we find Charizard in Johto? Why don't we find Typhlosion in Kanto? Why are these animal groups basically separated? And why is it so complete? The regional hypothesis accounts for that. So there's many creatures, especially dinosaurs. Yeah, we wouldn't expect the dinosaurs to be located in the same regions as cats, canines, elephants, bison. We'd expect humans to be, for the most part, in their own specific region as well. And so that's it. I mean, I'm not seeing any good rebuttals to the regional hypothesis. And I think that's the strength of it, because the evolutionists, Matt, they have a lot of what ifs, or they'll have a lot of why this, why that. Why not a mosasaur with a whale? Why not a plesiosaur with a dolphin? Okay, why not a coelacanth with a dolphin? You know, it's a double standard from these guys. But I wanted to showcase this as we start to wind down, Matt, because we've actually hit the majority of the points that we've wanted to hit, and we're almost at the 2.5 hour mark. And so feel free to touch on any final points you'd like to touch on as well, Matt, before we wrap up. But this goes back to fixation equilibrium, what we were discussing earlier, which is absolutely demolishes evolution, demolishes human evolution specifically, and also an old earth in general. And so to help this be a little more understandable, after the flood, you have 8 people, right? We talk about from the flood to Babel, you have faster rates of fixation. Mutations are accumulating. The population number is increasing, but the population is still geographically isolated for the most part, because they have not spread out to all parts of the globe. And so you have 8 people, they're growing, still a small isolated population. And so you have faster rates of fixation. Okay. Then you have the Babel dispersal, where people spread out to all parts of the globe. Okay. And today we have 8 billion people. 8 billion people. So phase 1 is fast fixation. That's in the blue. Phase 2 is the dispersal event. And then phase 3 is modern low fixation. So now it's basically zero. A person gets a mutation in Australia, it's basically zero chance that that's going to spread to fixation. But again, there's a counterbalance because of that time period from the flood to the Babel dispersal event. The evolutionary model also has their own time period where rates are fast. And Matt, you and I have demonstrated sufficiently that the multi-generational studies that Dan looks to, demographic distortion, isolated populations, not a good global representation of real mutation rate data like we get with Parsons, like we get with Howell, and so on and so forth. So because we've established a fast mutation rate, per generation mutation rate in the mitochondrial DNA, and as per Fatuma and other population geneticists, the mutation rate approximates the fixation rate. We have what? A fast per generation rate, a fast fixation rate, low diversity in both the mitochondrial chromosome and the Y chromosome. That's biblical time. This is biblical creation right here. This visual might help people. Mutations per generation, and then substitutions would be observed differences when we're observing differences between 2 people. Okay. Fatuma said the rate of fixation of mutations is theoretically constant. Fixation rate equals mutation rate. Selection isn't going to do much to slow that down. Selection's already been counted for anyways for most of these pedigrees and these studies that we look at in terms of mitochondrial DNA diversity worldwide. Okay. So at this point, I mean, does Dan and these militant critics, Matt, in your opinion, do they have anything? It's basically, or is it a tap out at this point? Either they got to come up with something new, brother, or they're just going to keep repeating the same arguments. What are your thoughts? What do you think they're going to do, Matt? How do you think they're going to address this?
Well, what they've done recently is they've gone through the journals to find any mutation rate they could find that would slow it down, right? That was their goal. Find anything we can to get away from those pesky young Earth creation timelines. And all that is really desperation, because it just doesn't change the overall consensus of everything, right? So to me, another rescue device. So once they abandon that, once they realize, well, guess what, that's in animals too, and there's no animal studies showing anything phylogeny based, they'll have to just either change the subject or invent something entirely new. That's usually what they do, because they have to, right? They can't look at the evidence for what it is, which is ironic, because we can use the observed information that we have and just go with it. They have to assume and just go with that. The irony in that is hilarious, because they say we're anti-science.
And yet we're the ones looking at the empirical scientific data. Isn't that right, Matt?
Exactly. The empirical data. Yep.
Well, brother, I think I think we've hit every point that we wanted to. I will let the audience know this. What we have planned are in-depth technical presentations of the majority of our articles and papers, especially the most important ones. Matt, he'll be working on one specifically dealing with Oklo, specifically dealing with an alternative hypothesis for how lead can be present in zircon crystals. I'll be doing a full presentation. I'm nearly complete on the regional hypothesis, the pre-flood biome hypothesis. I'll also be giving an updated presentation on ERVs that incorporates my segregated design model. And so we have a lot for you guys to look forward to in terms of in-depth presentations, in-depth lectures. And the reason why is because we'll then have an article, but also a lecture or presentation to go with that article for people that prefer a video or something to listen to over an article, or people that just like the best of both worlds. I kind of like the best of both worlds, Matt. I don't know about you, but I like a good technical article, but then I also like a good technical video or lecture that essentially covers the material in that article. So that's another step that we're going to be making, but we want to incorporate all of that into an expanded truth and research division. That would be truthandresearch.com. And so again, it's a call to action. If it's on your heart to support and make that a reality, we are about halfway there. And so you can support us through the website, over the donate option, through PayPal. You can also support us through Patreon. I can't read no articles. That's
Don't
why
worry.
We're thinking of you as well. That's why we're
Yeah.
going to get videos and lectures.
And don't worry,
as well.
you can take these articles and you can copy the contents and paste them in ChatGPT and hit the little icon at the bottom that shows a speaker, and it will read it back to you. So you don't have to read it all. You can just sit back and listen to all of the articles being read right back to you. And this article answers that question that I just saw go by.
And before you do that, let me just, Howard F., you can do a debate where we get you an interlocutor. You give a presentation. Your interlocutor gives a presentation. You guys can either have a discussion or cross-examination. So we don't shy away from debates, that's for sure. But since you're on the opposing side, we would also want a fellow informed creationist giving their own presentation and offering their own set of rebuttals. And I've got someone in mind, T-Rock. He's looking for debates. He loves the flood. So there we go. T-Rock versus Howard F. Who wants to see it happen? Because I'll make it happen gladly. Matt,
Nice.
Over to you, brother.
All right. I saw a question go by a minute ago, which reminded me. There we go. How did plants like eucalyptus radiate to Australia using a global flood model? Well, like most things, water current would probably be the most obvious dispersal of everything going on after a flood, and certain environments will be able to pick it up. Like we know Australia has a very unique diversity of things that got instantly blocked off and landlocked, and it mostly had to do with wind patterns as well. That's why there's that channel called the Wallace Line, and not even plants or animals can really get across it because the water's really deep and there's a massive wind channel that blows there. So the biodiversity are trapped on other sides once the water came up. And koalas are really stupid animals. Their brains are very smooth, and they choose eucalyptus as the main food because it's like crack to them. It's like a drug. And so they're living really high on it. They can eat other plants. They choose not to. They love this plant. And they're like literally high out of their minds all the time from eucalyptus. So they can eat other things, but they choose not to. They're like, no, I love this. That's why they do so much. That's why they fall out of trees and they're clumsy and stumble around, because they're literally high all the time because of eucalyptus. It's probably not their most optimal food. It's just what they choose because, like people, they're like, oh, that makes me feel really good. I'm going to get drunk. Same thing. They found a plant that makes them really high and they just love it. And that's all they eat. But they don't need to just eat eucalyptus. They've been seen to eat other plants. They just choose it. And since there's so much there, they love it. And they've adapted to just kind of eating it. But they don't need to just eat that. And how would they have gotten there? Again, there's lots of different patterns of that they could have. And that's what that article was about. You could read the migration after the flood. And I chose 3 of the hardest animals to explain: kangaroos, armadillo, and koala, because armadillo are only found in America, right? And kangaroo only in Australia, same with koala. So I figured, let's answer the most common questions. I was going to do penguin, but that's so easy. There's a penguin that swims 5,000 miles every year to go visit somebody in Brazil who saved his life. So obviously getting a penguin off of the ark over to anywhere on the earth would be very easy, because there's water everywhere after a flood. It just needed to hit the water and swim. So that would be kind of an easy, ridiculous thing to answer. So anyway, that was just one of the studies that's already up that you could read. I noticed a spelling mistake in it today, actually. I didn't send the updated version in, but it's just one word. So not too bad.
Very good, brother. Were you going to expand more on the migration after the flood here with your picture, or was that basically?
Oh, no. I mean, I could, but now there's probably too many questions. If anyone wants something specific, sure. But I mean, they've got the study themselves that they can go read.
Okay.
Sure.
Just want to make sure that you've iterated what you wanted to. Shepherd, thanks and blessings. $5 super chat. I appreciate the support. So last minute questions, and then I think we are going to wrap things up. Matt and I are going to be working behind the scenes, getting together our in-depth presentations on all of these topics. And then that way you guys can have an associated lecture basically to go with the article. And so also the several papers that we're working on as well, Matt, like radiocarbon revelations. It's funny. We put out one on helium and zircon crystals. And we have a section in there that goes straight to Dr. Russell Humphreys in this massive chart where he addresses all of the so-called rescue devices that have come in over the years, trying to deal with the data suggesting that the Earth is young because these zircon crystals are claimed to be billions of years old. Uranium to lead decay produces helium as a byproduct, but helium is very slippery. It leaks out into the atmosphere. There's far too much helium in these zircon crystals. If they really were billions of years old, they're claimed to be some of the oldest on the planet. And so that's a major challenge to those that believe in the billions of years paradigm. If those crystals really are billions of years, how's there so much helium? Anyways, we put out an article and we listed off through the work of Dr. Russell Humphreys all of the potential rescue devices and how they've been debunked. But then Simon Dan, prior to the video that we just responded to, some of it at least, he put out a video against us a few weeks back on the helium and zircon crystal issue. But he just repeated arguments, Matt, that have already been addressed. So the question I have for you is, are your really popular evolutionists, are you finding that they're up to date on what creationists are saying or out of date?
Oh, man. Well,
I find they're repeating arguments that we've already addressed, that have already been addressed in the literature itself.
Well, unfortunately, they're out of date, but then also, unfortunately, so are young Earth creationists. That's why we try to do these, because they're also behind on dates as well. And we want to give people a plethora of different types of answers. So, I think it's good that we can. Our goal is to be able to try to answer everything that people are interested in. Like, we have another group set of papers coming out called "What is a Kind?" because we keep getting that question. What is a kind? What is the definition? Give us an example of a kind. So, focusing on that is another thing no ministry has ever done, and we want to focus specifically on that. That's a good one. I like that topic a lot. So,
yes, as creationists, we should want to defend our models. We should want to address challenges, engage criticisms. And so in the same way that it's not a good look for evolutionists to be out of date or simply not advancing in terms of model building, it's not a good look for creationists as well. And so that's why you'll find we're putting in a lot of original research. My expanded endogenous retrovirus handbook, the appendices, the model that I put forward is original. It's advancing the debate with the segregated design model that explains both fixed and unfixed ERVs. It explains the true origin of retroviruses, that is harmful exogenous retroviruses. It explains both fixed and unfixed solo LTRs. We are engaging the critics like Dan on their best so-called mutation rate studies. And we are specifically countering rescue devices put forth by people like Stefan Frello, Dan Stern Cardinal, and others based on what we say on Neanderthals and out of Africa and so on and so forth. And so I want to show the audience here where they can go. As you can see, there's a lot here where they can go for the zircon. Here it is. Helium and zircon crystals. What tiny atoms reveal about Earth's age? And so for those that want to, in terms of critics, address this challenge, you're definitely going to want to go to the responses to critics section, strength through scrutiny, click the associated link, and have a look at that 2-column table listing what the critics have said. It also includes criticisms from Hugh Ross and then how they've been debunked. Because the evolutionist camp, you really want to make sure that you're not just repeating arguments, talking points, and rescue devices that have already been engaged or refuted. We want to advance the debate in a meaningful manner. So, Matt, over to you, brother. Any final words, final thoughts? It's 10:30 now. I got to make it to the store by the time it closes for 11. So I think we touched on everything we need to touch on. It's been comprehensive. It's been nonstop. I'm happy with it. The ball is in the court of the critics. It's time that they actually begin engaging challenges, because so far what we're showing, brother, is that biblical creation has the superior model in every field. Because even today we've talked a little bit about everything, haven't we? Biology, genetics, geology, paleontology. We're touching on it all, brother. Final words, final thoughts from you?
Yeah, it's hard to like really answer everybody's thing, because we'll jump around and we're trying to answer questions while playing a video and doing everything. So I recommend everybody to go check out the article section, read up on this studies, read about the new Pokemon concept, because it's going to expand. We want to broaden it. So if there's challenges and criticisms to it, good, bring them, because it'll help us answer them. We'll write more, and then eventually it'll just keep branching out and getting better, because that's how we do things. And that's why his endogenous retrovirus book now just updated to 2.0, because of all of the model building being done. The same thing will happen with this Pokemon analogy. Even Dr. Dan said he loves Pokemon, right?
He's apparently a fan, brother.
Perfect. Exactly. So you'll get arguments from him, and that'll just help us build even more, because he'll want to argue with you with Pokemon. So it'll be perfect. Can't go wrong.
Pokemon debate. It'll be a 2-in-1 debate. Pokemon and science. Who knows more about Pokemon? Who's got the better scientific model? People need to read this too, brother, that you put out. Later lead uptake, a new way zircons may get their lead, because, to give a teaser, Matt, so helium and zircon crystals, it's best explained by a young Earth model. Now, within the young Earth paradigm, we have this on our side. The Earth is young, right? Now, what's the best explanation within the correct view, the young Earth view of helium and zircons? Is it accelerated nuclear decay? Or could it be something else other than accelerated nuclear decay? And correct me if I'm wrong, Matt, you put forth in this journal article an alternative hypothesis on how the lead got there that doesn't invoke accelerated decay.
Correct. Absolutely. Because what happens is, if you look inside of a zircon crystal, you want to find a consistency, a theme where in the middle of the zircon crystal, it had, as it grew, it trapped uranium inside of it. And if uranium had decayed into lead, you would find the lead being in the center of the zircon crystal, because obviously if it's decaying, it's right next to it. However, if it had been trapped later from perhaps a crack in the crystal or heating that opened it up again and made it an open system instead of closed system, it would trap the lead on the perimeter or near the outside of the crystal as it as it would have either continued growing or had stopped entirely, and then heat would have trapped it again. So was it a later trapping? If so, we would find it more near the perimeter of zircon crystals. And guess what? We find a lot there. So isn't that interesting? If it can be an open system again, which they claim, zircon crystals are completely closed. But can they reopen? And what system actually causes them to reopen? And if it's so, can they be contaminated? And if they can be contaminated, that robs the ability for them to say that all of these the lead, the radiogenic lead that's there, came from the decay rate. This shows you that even helium can leach into it. Isn't that interesting?
That's
so
interesting.
We have another version now that shows that there's more answers than we were led to believe.
That was an interesting time when we were researching that issue. And It was one of those kind of light bulb moments with that one. And we've been having a lot of those moments over the last few months, Matt. And so to the audience, if you go to the website, standfortruthministries.com, click videos, scroll down to the bottom of the video section, past guests on Standing for Truth, and have some fun with this. Refuting the critics. Pick your critic, and we've put at least somewhere between 1 and 3 videos debunking that critic. Simon Dan, Redeemed Zoomer, theistic evolutionist, Dan Stern Cardinal, Richard Dawkins, Gutsa Gibbon. So we've basically tried to counter and tackle all of your most popular and prominent critics. Okay. I think we're ready to wrap things up. Matt, we're going to be doing more Q&As anyways. And so guitar tunings, I'll put Donny and Matt up against Eddie. For those that want to watch a really good debate, the debate we did over the summer with Conspiracy Cats, he's informed. He's a skilled debater. We're really happy that he agreed to do that. We'll be doing another one soon on modern day debate against 2 prominent evolutionists. We're going to be giving a presentation soon, another one over on Sam Shamoon's channel. We'll be taking some questions there. So we do have a lot for you guys to look forward to. It's a lot for us to look forward to as well. So we're ready and willing to take on any evolutionist that's willing to step into the debate coliseum. Matt, we're going to wrap things up. To the audience, thank you so much for tuning in. We had a lot of fun engaging your questions, criticisms, and challenges. And we've touched on a lot today. We'll make several shorter clips from it, Matt, in order that we can make some of this material just a little more digestible. God bless you all. Thank you for tuning in. Standing for Truth is out.